Honorable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our King, to his government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Please be seated. I just got to get a sip of water.
Introduction of visitors.
Order. Honorable members, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce a number of visitors joining us in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon. Her Excellency Margaret Venno, the Ambassador of the Kingdom of Netherlands, who was appointed in August 2024. Her Excellency is proud to work in Canada, a country that has special links to the Netherlands. Canadians liberated her birth town of Kempen and large parts of the Netherlands after the Second World War. Prior to her appointment, Her Excellency was an inspector for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. She is joined in her gallery by the Consul General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Vancouver. And I want to just provide a very special welcome to two important honorary Consul Generals of the Netherlands, both for Edmonton, a gentleman who's well known around these parts, Mr. Jerry Boma, and the Consul General, Honorary Consul General for the Kingdom of Netherlands in Calgary, a very well-known and respected Albertan, the two-time Olympic gold medalist, Catriona LeMay-Doan. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Yes.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park has a school group.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and to the members of the Assembly through you, I would like to introduce you to students from École Campbelltown in Sherwood Park. I had the opportunity to visit them a couple weeks back. They are a wonderful and bright, brilliant group of Canadians. Please rise, along with their teacher, Madame Marie Claire, and the visitors that are coming with them, and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
The Honourable Member for Athabasca Barhead Westlaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today I rise to introduce an incredible group of grade 5-6 students from École Maleg School in my constituency. They are here to tour the legislature, learn about our democratic process, and see firsthand how our assembly operates. I ask them to rise in the gallery and receive the warm welcome of this assembly.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to introduce Samantha, BJ, Kendall, and Derek. If they could please rise. They are representatives of the Alberta and Northwest Territories Heart and Stroke Foundation. February is Heart Month, and this year they're raising awareness about congenital heart disease. We thank them for their advocacy, for their presence here today. Please, colleagues, join me in welcoming them.
The Honourable Minister of Affordability and Utilities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to introduce to you and through you the guests from Atkins Realis, Ruby Littlechild, Stephanie Valancourt, Ian Edwards, and Sabrina Martineau. Would you please rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of the Assembly?
The Honourable Member for Calgary East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to introduce to you and through you Mr. Manav Chopra, CEO of Mahadeo Enterprises, a manufacturing company in Jalandhar, India. Mr. Chopra has strong ties to Alberta, with his children studying at Alberta universities and his brother residing here. Mr. Chopra, please rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of the Assembly.
The Honourable the Deputy Government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to introduce through you and to you a friend of mine from the town of Peace River, the Deputy Mayor of the town of Peace River, and we all know very much what it is to be busy with multiple committee assignments. At one point, Mark Boychuk sat on 23 boards and committees at one time for his passion for protecting and supporting youth and those in mental health and addiction. Mark, please rise and receive the very warm welcome of this chamber.
The honourable member for Edmonton Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you Amy Bassoon, a member of QP 3550, a resident of Edmonton Southwest, and someone who works tirelessly to support kids and who deserves fair pay along with her colleagues. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
The honourable member for Calgary-Beddington, did you have an introduction?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to introduce to you and through you a number of education support workers who have joined us today. I know they'd rather be in the classroom, but given that you're here with us, please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Are there other introductions? Seeing and hearing none, the clerk, please.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The honourable member for Leduc-Beaumont has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know the border we share with our neighbours to the south is a great source of economic activity and prosperity for our province. It is a starting point for many people entering our beautiful province for the very first time, and an entry for Albertans travelling to Montana and the rest of the United States. But as much as it benefits both sides when it comes to things like tourism, economic development, and trade, it does present some issues that require our close attention. We know that Alberta's border with the United States is vast, a full 298 kilometres. This is why, in December 2024, our government announced a $29 million investment for the creation of an interdiction patrol team, which is made up of 51 uniformed positions under the command of the Alberta Sheriffs. This investment will create vehicle inspection points where commercial vehicles will be stopped and searched by sheriffs who are well-trained and equipped with state-of-the-art technology to take on this new function. All of them have specialized interdiction training, which help them identify the specific indicators of illegal activities like drug smuggling and human trafficking, and provide them with the tools to identify criminals who carry out these dangerous and unwelcome activities. We know any gaps in coverage are exploited by opportunistic drug traffickers, illicit arms dealers, and other criminals, all to the detriment of public safety in our province. We have also added K9 units and 10 surveillance drones that are capable of flying in cold and windy weather. By collaborating effectively and acting with urgency, we can safeguard Albertans and address these pressing threats at their source. Thank you.
The honourable member for St. Albert is next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. That was quite a performance yesterday, Mr. Speaker. Albertans are demanding answers about the astounding UCP corruption and serious allegations of wrongdoing related to the $600 million corrupt care scandal. And what we got yesterday was an insult to Albertans' intelligence. Albertans are demanding an independent public inquiry, and the UCP says, yeah, take yes for an answer. There will be an independent inquiry, just not public. Only thing that surprised me yesterday was that the Premier wasn't wearing a red hat yelling witch hunt. They don't act like actual Conservatives, Mr. Speaker. I have respect for actual, true Conservatives. This government acts like entitled political ideologues more interested in covering their donkeys. In January, this government severed contracts 15 months early with a bunch of little organizations that support people with intellectual disabilities across Alberta to save $440,000. Now here's some perspective. UCP friend Sam Raish profited to the tune of $300,000 on the land he owned for just 3 months, sold it back to the UCP government. Wait lists for children with disabilities is so huge, UCP stopped reporting on it 4 years ago. Families cannot procure a contract from this government for their disabled children, while this government is using procurement to enrich their friends and insiders to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. UCP is planning to cut AISH by detouring people to a new AISH employment program they call ADAP. Minister says this is great. Severely disabled people currently on AISH or those applying for AISH can work. Never mind, the Alberta job market is not accessible to disabled Albertans, and we're the last province to even have accessibility legislation. This government is stunningly incompetent and corrupt. the harm this government is inflicting on Albertans while they continue to enrich and protect their friends is a stench that will stick to them for a long time, Mr. Speaker.
Order, order. The honourable member for Calgary Fish Creek has the call.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta's government is committed to building public transit that delivers the best value for taxpayers and the most benefit to transit users. In July 2024, Calgary City Council released a revised Green Line plan, increasing costs from an original $4.5 billion to $6.2 billion, while reducing the project's length from 47 kilometres with 29 stations to just under 10 kilometres with 7 stations. It is important to clarify that this decision to eliminate the northern extension beyond the Bow River was made solely by Calgary City Council. Alberta's government was not involved in this decision, despite misleading claims from the opposition to the contrary. This reduced scope plan raised serious concerns about ridership, financial sustainability, and increased risks due to the underground tunneling, which posed significant technical challenges and a higher risk of cost overruns. Given these challenges, Alberta government engaged AECOM to develop a better solution. The result is a cost-effective plan that extends the Green Line south to Shepherd, increasing the route by 76% to 7.2 kilometres, adding 5 more stations, and boosting projected ridership by 60% to approximately 55,000 daily users. This elevated design seamlessly integrates with Calgary's red and blue lines, provides a lower risk, cost-effective solution that provides greater accessibility for more communities while keeping the province's $1.53 billion investment intact. City Council has now approved this provincial proposal and has submitted a stronger business case to support federal approval of its $1.53 billion commitment. Additionally, this improved plan better connects key transit hubs, increases better accessibility, and ensures a more sustainable financial future for Calgary's transit system. Mr. Speaker, this improved plan is the best path forward. The time for delays is over. We are looking forward to seeing shovels in the ground. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest has a statement to make.
Do I want to be left holding the bag when the music stops? Do I want to be part of this government when the RCMP shows up and starts arresting people? Or do I want to stand on the side of what's right? Every UCP MLA and every UCP cabinet minister today should be asking themselves those questions. Because at the end of the day, it only ends one of 2 ways for them and for this Premier. The first option is straightforward, the correct one. A judge-led public inquiry may clear her, but you can only be cleared by that inquiry. That would be fair if that's what the process finds. But that would only happen in an atmosphere where the people who are being investigated are not running the investigation. Yes. But the other option ends with the end of her political career in the worst possible way, under a cloud of suspicion. So the Premier and this government has a choice. The members across the way have to make those choices too. If they want to be freed from the worst scandal in Alberta's history, the choice is very clear. Call a public inquiry. Yes. They can ask themselves, just as their colleagues did, the former infrastructure minister did, if they can stomach sitting there while more and more of these stories are unveiled. And they can call for the firing of the health minister, undoubtedly the worst health minister in Alberta's history. Yes. They can also call for the gag orders to be lifted so that the people they fired can tell us what really happens. And if they and the Premier don't want that, they should know the consequences of their choice. Corrupt care will hang over the rest of their political career.
Absolutely. The honourable member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo.
Mr. Speaker, commuting takes a toll. With over 10,000 Canadians flying from across Canada to work in the oil sands here in Alberta, thousands of workers risk their mental health and well-being of not only themselves, but their families. Imagine returning home after weeks away from long day and night shifts, physically and emotionally drained, desperate to hold on to your loved ones. As the weeks pass by, you realize your children have grown up without you. You've missed milestones and experienced their lives and experiences in their lives as you fly off yet again across the country to work. Working long shifts in challenging environments, away from family, you see that stress on marriages is prominent in these commuters' families. Depression and anxiety can set in. Substance abuse can become crutches in their lives. Mental health suffers. Meanwhile, communities in Northern Alberta have the capacity to address these issues. With affordable homes and proximity to top-notch grade and post-secondary schools with incredible access to healthcare and other services and extracurricular activities galore for the kids, Northern Alberta communities present a solution to the growing threat of mental health with these workers. The very same communities in the vicinity of these industrial operations offer a chance at a balanced life. It's things like these that are the cure for mental health challenges. Fort McMurray is one of those communities that showcases the promise of Northern Alberta. With beautiful parks, recreational facilities, and a rich cultural scene, Fort McMurray is the ideal place to balance work and life. The town has modern amenities, a strong sense of community, and abundant opportunities for personal and professional growth. It provides everything a family needs to thrive while being closely connected to the oil sands industry. It's a place where people create lasting memories, build careers, and enjoy the great outdoors. Mr. Speaker, we want workers to know that they are valued, and by building stronger northern communities, we'll ensure more people can trade their time for a stable, fulfilling life in Alberta's north rather than wasting it on airplanes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton West Henday has a statement to make.
Mr. Speaker, the average lifespan of Indigenous peoples in this province has plummeted below provincial average in the 2 terms the UCP have been in government. My people are expected to survive 20 fewer years than non-Indigenous Albertans. This is beyond acceptable. And we know that this gap grew since the UCP were elected. The root cause of this is the drug poisoning epidemic. And while my people die, the UCP are embroiled in corruption of their own making, allegedly. The Minister of Mental Health and Addiction says that the UCP are approaching the drug poisoning epidemic with deep compassion, allegedly. This is the same epidemic that the Premier promised Donald Trump that Alberta would crack down on, despite drugs originating in Canada into the U.S. accounting for less than 0.2% of drugs trafficked into the U.S. More drugs are being trafficked into Canada, despite the commentary from the Mar-a-Lago gangsters. Mr. Speaker, Albertans deserve better. In a province as rich as ours, where $500 million has been allegedly given to the UCP's close buddies for private health care, this is deplorable. All in exchange for what? Kickbacks from their wealthy buddies? This government should be ashamed of itself for allowing my people to continue to die because of something so preventable and manageable while doing nothing to help everyday Albertans in this crisis. This includes only approving 2 projects under the Indigenous Primary Healthcare Innovation Fund for grants to projects of up to $5 million. How many communities could have benefited from $500 million that instead went into corrupt care? 120, Mr. Speaker. Instead of empathy on this crisis, the UCP hits back with defensiveness. When I bring up in this House that I've personally lost family members after family member, including just yesterday, the minister responsible for this crisis asked me to rise to my feet to speak to the deaths of my kin. Well, I am, and we have had enough.
Order. Honourable members, I would like to take a brief moment and draw to the attention of the Assembly the ruling that the Speaker made yesterday with respect to points of order. And, well, I take no position on any, or with respect to the use of member statements here inside the chamber, which became the subject of a point of order yesterday. While I take no position on any of the statements made today, I might just draw to the attention of members of the Assembly that many of the that many personal type attacks were made today in statements that were made by members, yet yesterday some of those same members raised a point of order when that was done against them. My point remains the same, that civility is always in order, and members will ultimately decide how we continue to use member statements. But as they were today, uninterrupted, if that is the case, I would encourage us to be much more civil in our actions, or it's likely to continue to lead to a lack of order. Honourable members, the time is now 1:50, and that makes it order. It's my second order. It's my second favorite part of the day. But now it's 1:50, and that makes it oral question period. And the leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition has question 1.
Mr. Speaker, Albertans deserve an ethical, competent government. But yesterday, the Premier avoided questions about what she knew when, which only makes this government look worse and increases the rampant skepticism that Albertans have right now. So, trying again. Alberta Health Services former CEO states last November she hired a law firm to start a forensic audit of AHS to look into allegations of corruption in the bloated contracts at the heart of this corrupt care scandal. When did the Premier first learn of this forensic audit at AHS?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I learned from my health minister that there was a look-see into the cost of different surgeries at different clinics. One of the things that she raised with me is why was there such a difference? And I can tell you, didn't get these numbers until the Globe and Mail started doing stories on it because, as you know, Mr. Speaker, politicians aren't involved in these contract negotiations. But in October of 2022, ASG got signed up to a deal for a HIP for $8,303, and then just 3 months later, ClearPoint got signed up for a deal at $3,622. Why was there such a difference? That's what we need to get to the bottom of, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the AHS CEO launched the forensic audit when she learned of bloated contracts that looked like potential corruption. For protecting Albertans' interests, she should have been giving kudos, not a pink slip. AHS notified the Auditor General about the forensic audit. AHS notified the Minister of Health about it. But the former CEO says that the minister told her to, quote, wind it up, end quote. Does the Premier find it acceptable, given she wants to find answers, that the Minister of Health told AHS to wind up a forensic audit that was supposed to root out the problems and potential illegal activity?
The Honourable Premier is risen.
One more time, Mr. Speaker. I'll just put some timestamps on things. October of 2022 was in the transition period between myself coming in and the new old Premier going out. And it was when we had a different health minister in place. January of 2023, we had a different health minister in place as well. And the question that we have for AHS, the individuals who are signing the contracts, is why within the space of 3 months did they sign one contract with ASG for a knee surgery for $8,510, and then with one organization, and $3,276 at another. We have to get to the bottom of this, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
The question I and all Albertans have is why would the Premier and the Minister of Health cancel a forensic audit designed to get to the answer of this? The former CEO of AHS hired a law firm for the right reasons. The UCP fired everyone who knew about the audit. It looks like burying evidence. They fired the CEO and their handpicked board. We've just learned they're firing even more people at AHS right now. Mr. Speaker, it said the health minister was, quote, dismissive of the need to continue the internal investigation, end quote. And it looks like they're still dismissive now. Will the Premier stop the firings and call a judicial inquiry?
The order, the Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, let me just put more information on the record. October of 2022, when there was a different health minister in place, shoulder surgeries were signed off with one organization for $11,243, and another 3 months later for $3,847. Politicians do not have any role in the issuance of RFPs, the awarding of a contract, or the signing of these documents. And so the question we have is what was going on at Alberta Health Services? We'll get to the bottom of it.
Order. A point of order is noted at 1:54. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition for a second set of questions.
On the one
hand, the Premier says politicians do not have a role, and on the other, the Premier's former Chief of Staff is at the heart of the corrupt care scandal. He went on a witch hunt, chasing whistleblowers in AHS, including threatening, quote, consequences if certain public servants weren't fired. The former CEO alerted the Premier's Deputy Minister on October 4th about her concerns about this guy. Given that the Premier's most important official knew about these concerns, on what day did the Premier learn about what her Chief of Staff had been saying to the AHS CEO? The accusations are about political interference, Premier.
Yeah. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is at issue is what is happening in the contracting at Alberta Health Services. Alberta Health Services has been in control of the procurement process through all of this. It predates me, it predates this health minister. When it became evident that there were different fees charged for different services to different facilities, the health minister raised it with me and said we're looking into it. There has been no evidence of any wrongdoing. We are bringing the documents forward so that the Auditor General and an independent third party can investigate it, and we'll get to the bottom of any wrongdoing if it occurs. If there's problems with the procurement process at AHS, we're going to make sure we don't replicate them.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
The Premier is wrong. What is at issue is political interference, corruption, and kickbacks. Yes. The Premier's Chief of Staff told the AHS CEO that he would, quote, be taken care of for life, end quote. Now, if that Chief of Staff or any other staff in the Premier's office were accepting payments, bribes, kickbacks, or any other undisclosed benefits, it could be criminal. That former Chief of Staff to this Premier said he's willing to cooperate with any investigation. He can answer any questions he wants. So, to the Premier, when was the last time you talked to that Chief of Staff?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there's sure a lot of slander and defamation going on in people who are not in this chamber. I would just caution the member opposite that I know she has privilege in here, but I would just caution the member opposite to wait until
Order. One thing I do know is that the Premier had no problem hearing the question because she sat there and listened to it. I think it's reasonable that she can give an answer that people can also hear.
We are interested in getting to the bottom of the allegations, which is why we have set up a SharePoint and shared all the documents with the Auditor General, and why we will be having an independent third party to investigate the matter and report back on how we can change the procurement processes. If there are any individuals within Alberta Health Services procurement who are guilty of wrongdoing, we'll get to the bottom of it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition for a third set of questions.
Mr. Speaker, this is serious. The Premier has already lost a cabinet minister. The issue of potential corruption rises to her office. The Premier's Chief of Staff reports to just one person, the Premier. If she didn't know what he was doing or wasn't briefed on what was happening in her office, that is on her. And people have been fired for a lot less than what we already know about now. Will the Premier finally call a public inquiry, ensure that Albertans get the answers to the questions they're asking, including answers from that former Chief of Staff?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, here's what Albertans want us to get to the bottom of. We gave AHS $3.5 billion more between 2019 and 2024, and they actually ended up doing fewer surgeries with more money. Where did the money go? The only place that we have been getting any additional surgeries, Mr. Speaker, is
Order. The Honourable the Premier.
The only place we've been getting additional surgeries, Mr. Speaker, is the charter surgical facilities, and it appears to us like there's a concerted effort among Alberta Health Services management to try to derail that program. That's a policy decision of government, and we're not going to let them derail it.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
To be clear, what Albertans want is ethical, competent government and to get to the bottom of the corrupt care scandal. The Premier does not seem to know what conflict of interest means when she attacks our healthcare system for delivering surgeries in hospitals for Albertans. Yeah. The Premier's handpicked board chair, Lyle Oberg, has personal experience setting up private hospitals. That is not someone opposed to the Premier's agenda. But as soon as the AHS board, including Lyle Oberg, was part of suggesting to call in the RCMP, they fired him along with everyone else. Will the Premier release Lyle Oberg and all the other fired AHS board members from the gag order that this government put on them?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, here is what we are trying to get to the bottom of. In 2019, acute care facilities operated by Alberta Health Services did 252,000 surgeries. 6 years later, with $3.5 billion additional dollars, they're at 251,050 surgeries. Meanwhile, charter surgical facilities over the same time were doing 43,000 surgeries. Today, they are doing 58,950. The members opposite would shut those facilities down, cancel 60,000 different procedures, and put all of our patients who need those services at risk.
Members, a point of order is noted at 2 o'clock. The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, in order to get to the bottom of what Albertans want, not what the Premier wants, the gag order needs to be lifted because the Premier's story does not make sense. The Deputy Minister of Health fired the AHS CEO on January 8th, then the Minister of Health fired the board of January 31st, replaced them with her Deputy Minister, then on February 12th used his powers as one-man board to name himself the new CEO. He made that retroactive to January 8th, and there's more, but I can't fit it into 35 seconds. This is ridiculous. Will the Premier release all of these former AHS officials from their gag orders so we can get answers?
Order the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General and our independent counsel is going to be able to talk to whoever they need to get to the bottom of the matter. And here is the truth, Mr. Speaker. We have sent a direction to Alberta Health Services to become a service provider so that they can increase the number of surgeries they perform, so that they can focus on hospitals. They resisted us at every turn, and now we gave the direction in November of 2023 that we were going to be moving the function of contracting out of Alberta Health Services and into Alberta Health, and that's what we're going to do, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The UCP handpicked the CEO and then fired them. The UCP handpicked the board at AHS and then fired them. They've done this multiple previous times to CEOs and boards. When they talk about who's been restricting them, they're talking about their own people. They've had control of AHS. Yesterday, the former infrastructure minister said, quote, "We can't continue the cycle of dismissing person after person, and they're trying to gaslight us into thinking that somehow everybody who goes into AHS becomes corrupted by the system," end quote. The best disinfectant is sunshine. When will the Premier call a judicial-led public inquiry?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have already engaged the Auditor General. We are very close to engaging outside counsel who is going to look into the bottom of these allegations. The bottom line that we want to get to is, why does Alberta Health Services, despite getting billions and billions of additional dollars every single year, why do they fail to deliver on a higher number of surgeries? The only reason we're seeing an increase in the number of surgeries is because of charter surgical facilities. They get paid on the basis of the surgeries they provide. That's the reason this government has made a policy decision to go in that direction, and it's working, Mr. Speaker.
The point of order is noted at 2:03. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
The health minister is at the centre of the worst corruption scandal in Alberta's history. She's trying to bob and weave around questions she doesn't want to address, but her shaky non-answers are not fooling Albertans. Here's the former infrastructure minister, quote, "They're in charge of the information forthcoming to the Auditor General. They are the filter. They'll determine what information gets turned over. There is a conflict of interest if you're investigating yourself." That's right. I could not agree more. The minister doesn't have the trust of her colleagues or Albertans, so why doesn't she just step down?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've spent my life as a servant leader, making sure that I do the right thing. So, Mr. Speaker, my goal has always been, since I became the Minister of Health, to improve significantly the health of Albertans in this province. AHS has been a big black box that we have not been able to look into for a very long time, and that has to end. Mr. Speaker, I, as well as the Premier, want to make sure that the Auditor General has everything that they need, as well as an independent review that will get truly to the bottom of this issue.
The order, the Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud.
It's like the minister doesn't realize she's been part of the UCP government for 6 years. I know the minister likes to silence people who ask uncomfortable questions about what's happening under her watch, but she can't silence the opposition and she can't silence Albertans. It appears that the former infrastructure minister was right. Just yesterday, the chief information officer of AHS and other high-ranking information officials were fired. You know, the ones responsible for providing information to the AG and any third-party investigator. So what story will the health minister nervously spin up today to explain this part of the cover-up?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, again, the member opposite has misinformation. I am aware that 425 AHS staff were notified that their positions would be transferring to the new acute care agency. We have said it all along. With the refocusing, people have to move to the new pillars. Mr. Speaker, of those positions, there are 5 positions that were identified for elimination that would not be required by the acute care agency. They're not frontline staff. They're not involved with procurement, Mr. Speaker, and that is part of the process. We've already moved people to primary care as well as to Recovery Alberta.
Point of order is noted at 2:05. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whitemud for second summons.
The chief information officer was fired, and every time the health minister hides behind a prepared statement, Albertans are reminded why she is unfit to remain as health minister. If she won't answer questions, she should step down, unless hiding is the point, which clearly it is. As our UCP colleague said yesterday, quote, "We can't continue the cycle of dismissing person after person, and they're trying to gaslight us into thinking that somehow everybody who goes in there becomes corrupted by the system. At some point, we have to take a look at those making decisions, doing the dismissals." So I couldn't have said it better myself. Minister, the call is coming from inside the House. Will you answer it?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition finds this funny, but I certainly don't. I applaud the Premier and I applaud the Minister of Health for undertaking what is an incredibly difficult task of refocusing our healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, Albertans pay their taxes and they deserve quality health care that they are not getting access to, and we're going to get to the bottom of all the problems. But Mr. While the opposition chooses to cast aspersions on the government side, I have full faith in the Minister of Health and the Premier of Alberta.
Order, order, order. A point of order is noted at 2:07. The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Glenora is next.
After 2 weeks of parties on the eastern seaboard in an attempt to dodge the public, the media, and the official opposition, the Premier and the Minister finally showed their faces and tried to change the channel. With UCP disinformation, public surgeries are less expensive than US-style private ones. The Premier's hand-picked infrastructure minister, the first MLA to support her publicly 2 years ago, quit and cried corruption across multiple ministries. He wasn't willing to take the fall for the Premier. Clearly, the UCP government policy is to double down on their cover-up. So who over there is going to take the fall for the Premier today?
The Honourable the Government House Leader. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind the House and the members opposite that the use of chartered surgical facilities is a policy decision that's been in place since 1990 under not only the UCP but also the PCs and the NDP. The member opposite also had chartered surgical facilities. At the time that she was in my role, Mr. Speaker, they completed roughly about 15% of surgeries through chartered surgical facilities. How hypocritical are they now?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Given that you don't have to be a brain surgeon to know that brain surgery takes more time and costs more money than a knee replacement, nor do you have to be the head of accounting to understand that CIHI gets their numbers from AHS and the Government of Alberta, and given that the numbers that the Premier used for AHS hips and knees were patently untrue, how can the Health Minister expect Albertans to trust her with our public health care when she stands beside the Premier and the Premier peddles disinformation about bloated private contracts?
Point of order is noted by the honourable member for Edmonton Whitemud at 2:09, and then followed by the government House Leader at 2:09 and 30 seconds. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is casting dispersions on the Canadian Institute of Health Information, CIHI. It's an independent, not-for-profit organization funded primarily by the federal government. It is considered the most credible source on comparable health care data for governments right across this country. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite would have been using CIHI for their numbers when they were in office, Mr. Speaker. We have to trust the system, and we're going to trust the process, that we're going to get down to the bottom of what's going on at AHS.
The honourable member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Great if we actually had a government we could trust. And given that the Premier blamed cancer patients for getting cancer, then she pulled surgeons and nurses and anaesthetists out of public hospitals, pushing them into private surgical centres, and then blamed the public hospitals for not doing more surgeries. We know public surgeries are less expensive. It's in black and white. The minister gives that data to CIHI, and then the minister stands beside the Premier while the Premier spreads disinformation. So will the Health Minister do the right thing and pause all private surgical contracts until the judge-led private inquiry, public inquiry, we call a judge-led public inquiry, so we can all get to the bottom of this?
Order. A point of order is noted at 2:12. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I find it rich from the member opposite. Let's not forget that when the member opposite oversaw this file, a well-respected CEO not only quit, but also gave up her severance because she was worried about escalating political interference, stating that political ideology was trumping evidence-based decision-making, Mr. Speaker. The NDP can fear-monger all they want, but their record was one that they should not be proud of. In fact, Mr. Speaker, wait times went up 4 years straight. And interfering in contract negotiations was something that was also mentioned at that time. Not only that, but while we have committed to accountability and third-party investigators, the NDP's approach was to go to voicemail.
The honourable member for Lethbridge West.
Mr. Speaker, while the UCP is wrapped up in the corrupt care scandal, there are over 40,000 people in Lethbridge without a family doctor, without access to primary health care. I hear stories every day about the need for higher levels of access to public health care in Lethbridge. Why is the Minister of Health and her government committed to spending hundreds of millions of dollars on private surgical facilities to benefit their friends while people in Lethbridge can't get basic health care?
Minister of Health.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I'd like to notify the member opposite that we are in fact doing very well in terms of recruiting more physicians right across the whole province. When I first started in 2023, June of 2023, we had roughly about 10,000, 6,000 physicians in the province. We now are over 12,200 physicians, of which we've seen an increase of family physicians of about 300. Mr. Speaker, that number continues to increase because of the streamlining of the process that we are doing in conjunction with the College of Physicians and Surgeons.
The honourable member for Lethbridge West.
Mr. Speaker, given that women in Lethbridge cannot find a family doctor, many more can't find an OBGYN. And given that far too many OBGYNs have left the city, combined with the shortage of anesthesiologists and labour and delivery units, is forcing patients to travel hours away from Lethbridge for care or face surgery delays. To the Minister, why is she choosing to remain in her position, dragging out the scandal by preventing a public inquiry, instead of getting out of the way and allowing someone to fix problems this minister has created?
The Honourable Minister, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to rise and answer a question on behalf of the Minister of Health, who doesn't need to gratify that ridiculous question with an answer about stepping down. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we have full confidence in the Minister of Health and full confidence in the Premier to refocus health there, to make sure that Albertans get the services and the surgery wait times that they deserve.
The honourable member for Lethbridge West.
Mr. Speaker, given that the Minister and her party promised Lethbridge a cardiac catheter lab at Chinook Regional Hospital not once, but twice, both in 2019 and 2023, without any serious developments to date, and given that the Minister seems to have money to hand out to her friends and donors, like over $600 million that will pay for facilities that we do not own and have no limits on how much profits these clinics can rake in, to the Minister, will this Minister step aside so this government can invest into public healthcare facilities like the cardiac catheter facility at Lethbridge Regional Hospital?
Order. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to let the member opposite know that, in fact, we are going to be investing in Lethbridge. We have already seen the functional, the assessment, the needs assessment that was done that indicates that we do need a cardiac catheterization lab in Lethbridge. It's also the reason why Red Deer needed a cardiac catheterization lab, and the members opposite, when they were in office, did not do anything to support that. In fact, Mr. Speaker, they took Red Deer off the capital infrastructure plan because they felt Red Deer wasn't worthy enough to get a new hospital. Mr. Speaker, we're going to make sure there's cardiac catheterization in Red Deer and Lethbridge.
Honourable members. With absolute apology to the House, the Speaker takes absolute sole and full responsibility for getting us out of order. The question will be the Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat, followed by the Honourable Member for Edmonton South. The Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta's government is fostering partnerships with the U.S., CBSA, and RCMP to improve joint operations aimed at intercepting illicit drugs such as fentanyl before they reach our communities. Our commitment is to ensure the safety and well-being of all Albertans by proactively addressing the challenges posed by cross-border crime. Can the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Services please explain what is being done to fight the deadly fentanyl that is crossing our borders?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety, the Deputy Premier, has
risen. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. And certainly we are taking very much a Team Canada approach. We're working very closely with the CBSA. We're working with the national RCMP, and of course we have deployed 51 sheriffs to the border in southern Alberta. I can tell you it's already yielded some very positive results, Mr. Speaker, from intervening when it comes to human trafficking, to arrests, to drugs that have been seized, to a multiple range of dealing with the opioid crisis and the drugs that have been flowing to and from the United States into Canada and Canada to the United States. We're continuing to work on this Team Canada approach and support the people of Alberta to keep them safe.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for that answer. Given that we are told that more boots on the ground will be used to fight the crime within Alberta municipalities, and given that we acknowledge that all the crime and social disorder caused by drugs, including fentanyl, trafficked across the U.S.-Canada border and interprovincial borders are immense, and given this puts strain on policing, public safety, family and community support services across Alberta, can the same Minister please explain what is being done to secure Alberta's southern border, including in my riding?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety, the Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this is a multi-pronged approach. Obviously, we're dealing with the southern border. We're dealing with the organized crime, as well as the other gangs that have infiltrated Canada through the softened crime policies of the Liberal NDP, Mr. Speaker. But we're also making sure that we're dealing with this from a social and civil disorder, Mr. Speaker. And I was very proud to stand with the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Mayor Sohi, as well as other mayors in the province of Alberta, to make sure that we are taking a coordinated effort with our peace officers and our police officers to tackle the social and civil disorder and go after those organized crime and make sure we're taking care of drug dealers and putting them in jail.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister. Given that we are implementing specialized training programs for law enforcement personnel to better equip them to handle drug-related incidents and understand the complexity of substance abuse, and given that Alberta's government continues to make serious commitments on cracking down on crime where we know it's happening, as recently seen in my riding with the scan bust in Medicine Hat, And further, given that Alberta's government is making significant investments to bolster law enforcement and combat drug-related issues, can the same minister tell this House what this government is doing to support law enforcement across this province?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thanks, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, member, for the question and all the great work that he's doing in the Medicine Hat area. I can tell you that we're investing $55.7 million in the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team to support 434 positions that are going to be spread right across these specialized teams right throughout this province, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you that organized crime is a problem not just in Alberta but also in Canada. The RCMP have identified over 4,000 organized crime groups in this country, and that, quite frankly, has to do with the soft on crime policies of the Liberal NDP. We're going to fight that, Mr. Speaker.
Order, order, order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton South has a question to ask.
Mr. Speaker, the UCP is investing over $600 million into private healthcare surgeries instead of investing in our public healthcare. That's taxpayers' dollars, paying for infrastructure we don't own and benefits the UCP friends and insiders. We need hospitals in Edmonton, particularly the South Edmonton Hospital, to serve one of the fastest growing communities in Alberta. Will the Minister of Health tell my constituents why this government is enriching the UCP's friends instead of building this badly needed hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member opposite knows full well that when the members opposite were in government, they actually announced the South Edmonton Hospital with no plan whatsoever, no plan, no business plan, nothing, Mr. Speaker. There's been a lot of work that's gone into it. It's come back at a $4.9 billion investment, which has to be looked at, Mr. Speaker. There is opportunities to do something different that would actually provide services to Edmontonians in a much quicker, faster fashion, and we'll do that.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Well, given that the UCP knows that the Edmonton region is on track to be about 1,500 hospital beds short of what's needed by 2026, and given that even if the South Edmonton Hospital was built by then, the deficit will still be 1,000 beds, and given that Albertans deserve a competent, ethical government and not a government-wide scandal, how can constituents of Edmonton South convince the health minister to get the South Edmonton Hospital built, and does this government expect a kickback?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, those are ludicrous questions. Of course, we want to make sure that Edmontonians have, particularly in South Edmonton, have access to good quality health care. We also want to make sure that they get it in a timely fashion, that they're able, that whatever we're able to build, that it'll be able to be built quickly and will meet the needs, not just for now, but into the future. Mr. Speaker, there'll be more to come. I don't want to preempt the minister's budget coming up. More to come in days to come.
The Honourable Member.
Well, given that the Minister of Health has said in this chamber many times that the South Edmonton Hospital was not needed, I find it a bit rich that she's saying that there'll be other ways. And given that the Premier said to my constituents that they could drive to the Red Deer Hospital, showing that she's clearly out of touch and has the wrong priorities, and given that anyone named in this Alberta health care scandal must step aside for a public inquiry, will the Health Minister finally do the right thing, step aside, and allow for a public inquiry into this corrupt care scandal?
The Honourable the Minister of Health. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
The opposition is so happy to see me. I mean, the short answer is no. The Minister of Health will not step aside, Mr. Speaker. And again, I reiterate what I've said earlier today. I applaud the Minister of Health and I applaud the Premier for taking these very difficult initiatives of refocusing healthcare. While our leader is here every day leading this province to what I think is a brighter future, the members opposite don't have a leader, a rudderless ship. Their leader won't even show up into the building. So, Mr. Speaker, the question is, where is Naheed Nenshi?
Order, order, order. Order, order, order. Order. The Honourable Member for Laxton and Parkland has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By now we've become too familiar with fentanyl. It's a cheap synthetic opioid which contributes to devastating communities across Canada and the U.S. Fentanyl is easy to produce, highly addictive, and outright deadly. Just 2 milligrams of the drug can kill an adult, yet the NDP leader claims that 44 pounds of fentanyl ain't no big deal. That's enough to kill about 2 million people, Mr. Speaker. This government will never downplay fentanyl crisis. Every milligram that we take away from streets means lives saved. To the Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, can you tell this Assembly about our government's progress on the opioid crisis, please?
The Honourable the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is that it is a lot, contrary to what Mr. Nenshi says publicly. 44 pounds is a lot of fentanyl, Mr. Speaker. It's 10 million lethal doses. This government's taking clear action. It cannot be downplayed and say Mexico is worse than Canada. I'm not Mexican, I'm Canadian, and I care about reducing all deaths from fentanyl here at home and abroad. That's why we've introduced the Alberta recovery model, and we've massively reduced overdose deaths from opioids, down 38% year over year for the first 10 months of 2024. Mr. Speaker, no other province across the country is anywhere near that. That's a 300% greater decrease than British Columbia, our nearest partner, with a completely different model, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint Parkland.
Thank you to the Minister for the answer. Given that 79% of all opioid overdose deaths recorded in Canada between January and June of 2024 involve fentanyl, that's a 39% increase since 2016. And given that U.S. Borders and Customs Protection's data shows that roughly 44 pounds of fentanyl were seized in Canada on the U.S. border between October 2023 and 24, and given that 3 pounds of fentanyl were stopped at our own borders between Montana and Alberta, that's about 130 deaths, or 30,000 deaths if you're keeping track. Can the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Services explain the actions our government is taking to stop the flow of that deadly fentanyl across our borders?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and of course we take this very seriously. We all know that we're less safe in this province, in this country, because of the Liberal NDP policies. We all know that, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we as a province have worked with the CBSA and the National RCMP to redeploy resources down to the border. We have done a $29 million investment towards interdiction patrol teams. There have been 51 uniformed officers, 10 surveillance drones, K-9 units. Mr. Speaker, this is what a collaborative approach in dealing with a crisis is, Mr. Speaker. We're an example not just here in Alberta, but quite frankly for the rest of Canada, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Given that Alberta has faced a surge in clandestine fentanyl production, given that alert teams have dismantled highly sophisticated fentanyl super lab capable of producing lethal doses on an industrial scale out near Valley View last November, and further given those development highlights the real crisis, not only fentanyl flowing from our borders, but for domestic production. Can the same minister explain what steps his government is taking to prevent the expansion of those deadly super labs?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, it's the enormous investment that we have in our Alberta law enforcement response teams and all of our law enforcement throughout the province of Alberta, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you and the member, quite frankly, that Alberta's largest ever fentanyl super lab near Valley View was seized more than $300 million, including 7 kilograms of processed fentanyl, 4,200 liters of precursor chemicals and equipment, Mr. Speaker. Organized crime is a problem not just here in Alberta, but right throughout Canada. Mr. Speaker, this is because of the direct policies of the Liberal NDP. We're fighting back, Mr. Speaker. Albertans are fighting back, and Canadians are fighting back against Liberals and NDP.
The Honourable Member for Leduc Beaumont has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta has a diverse, resilient economy built on a foundation of several strong industries which drive growth. Protecting Alberta's economic interests will always be a top priority for our government. To the Minister of Jobs, Economy and Trade, how can we strengthen our economy by leveraging trade relationships with other provinces and international markets and protect our economic interests?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for that question. Mr. Speaker, with intensifying international trade challenges, removing domestic trade barriers is critical to ensuring Alberta's long-term prosperity. That's why Alberta has already removed over 80% of our national trade exceptions since 2019, leading all of Canada. Beyond our borders, Alberta is strategically growing exports and attracting investment across key sectors, targeting markets in the Americas, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. By working closely with our national and international partners, we're ensuring Alberta businesses have access to new markets, driving economic growth and long-term prosperity for Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Leduc Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for that answer. Given that Alberta has a world-class energy economy, including a rising clean energy sector built on technological innovation, can the same minister please explain to this House what our government is doing to attract investment in renewable energy and technology to ensure long-term economic growth?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you for that question. Mr. Speaker, Alberta's $15 million investment and growth fund has already secured over $765 million in private investment, creating thousands of jobs for Albertans. Companies like Aplexus Technologies and Fortinet are choosing Alberta, and with tools like Alberta Site Selector, we're making investments easier than ever before. We are also leading in next-generation energy technologies, from hydrogen and small modular nuclear reactors to geothermal and carbon capture. Alberta's future is strong, ambitious, and built to last, because when Alberta leads, Canada wins.
The Honourable Member for Leduc Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for that answer. Given that the strength of our economy is driven by a commitment to developing and sustaining a skilled workforce and enhancing competitiveness, can the same minister please explain what steps our government can take to improve workforce skills and meet the demands of evolving industries to secure our economic future?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta's government is investing in workforce training to equip workers with in-demand expertise. As industries evolve, our government's training opportunities ensure Albertans are prepared for the jobs of the future. Last year alone, almost 31,000 Albertans received training and employment supports through our government's targeted programs. More than 20,000 workers benefited from direct advancement opportunities, upskilling their capabilities and reinforcing our strong workforce for the future. Our goal is to provide secure, high-paying, high-quality employment for all Albertans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
My question is to the Minister of Health. Sherwood Park does not have a full functioning hospital, and it is becoming clear, sadly, why that is. Over $600 million of taxpayer money has been given to a private health company, a company that wildly overcharges for surgeries and doesn't come close to fulfilling contracts for medicine, though I do hear they are a great hookup for luxury box seats. To the Minister, was it all worth it? Was the scandal worth leaving the people of Sherwood Park without proper health care?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is a ridiculous statement. I am concerned about every Albertan making sure that they have excellent health care in this province. Everyone in this House should be concerned that Alberta Health Services gets roughly about $19 billion with next to no accountability, Mr. Speaker. That has to change. We have got an internal investigation that's going to go on, and it's going to be external to government, Mr. Speaker, as well as the Auditor General. We have to trust the process and make sure it gets done properly.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Given that Sherwood Park has a small community hospital that offers emergency care and other daytime services, but the good people of Sherwood Park deserve a full functioning hospital in our community. And given that Sherwood Park also has a very good hockey team, they're set up to make a deep playoff run this season. It's tremendous hockey. It's a lot of fun to watch. Will the Minister of Health tell this House if the constituents of Sherwood Park pay for the Premier to attend a Sherwood Park Crusaders playoff game? Will the Minister make sure that Sherwood Park gets a fully operational hospital it needs?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, Sherwood Park and every location in Alberta deserves excellent health care. Mr. Speaker, as soon as we can understand where the money is going, as the Premier has stated, over $3 billion more in just a few years, and where is that money going, Mr. Speaker? We all need to know. Mr. Speaker, there is a reason why I had to put in 18 directives to Alberta Health Services to get information and cooperation on the refocusing, Mr. Speaker. We need an excellent health care for every Albertan.
The order, the Honourable Member for Sherwood Park.
Given that the only black box that we cannot see into is the UCP cabinet, given that the UCP wants to blame AHS leadership for the corrupt care scandal, which is rather confusing considering they hand-selected those same leaders, and given that the only contracts that should have been ripped up are those of these bloated surgical centres rather than the contract of the AHS CEO who's trying to get to the bottom of all of this, to the Minister, is this the worst corruption scandal in Alberta history? Or is it the worst incompetence scandal in Alberta history? Or is it both?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
I believe the members opposite were fired for incompetence, Mr. Speaker, just a few years ago. But, Mr. Speaker, the government will be filing our statement of defence very shortly, and we will be vigorously defending against this claim that has been put forward. I am committed to ensuring that we have, in fact, a robust, transparent process in place for procurement and making sure that all Albertans can see into what is happening within our healthcare system. There has to be transparency, and we're committed to it, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to work really hard to get that done.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly, Clairview.
Mr. Speaker, thousands of educational support workers are on strike and healthcare workers are in the middle of bargaining. But instead of doing its job, this government is mired in the worst corruption scandal in Alberta's history. It is alleged that $600 million were wasted on bloated contracts under, quote, special terms to a private company. Those millions could have gone to fair bargaining for workers or more surgeries for public hospitals or a myriad of other priorities. To the Minister, why is this government prioritizing handouts to friends instead of hiring more workers and paying them all the wages they deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Education has risen.
Mr. Speaker, we're working to ensure that our school divisions have the resources and supports that they need to continue to deliver a world-class education. We're working aggressively to ensure that we prioritize literacy and numeracy screening for our earliest learners to ensure that they are set up with the right foundations for success. As well, we acknowledge and understand the significant enrollment pressures that many of our school boards are facing. That's why we're committed to building 90 new schools over the course of the next few years, and we're also making additional investments into operations.
The order, the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Beverly, Clairview.
Given that a health minister distracted by scandal means the crisis of healthcare worker recruitment and retention continues, given that additional legal distractions mean EMS shifts remain unfilled and nurses and other healthcare professionals continue to work short, and given that corrupt care has shaken the already precarious foundations of trust these workers have in their government, given that lack of trust by frontline workers and resulting instability, what would this minister say to frontline workers who today are calling for her to step aside?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to address our frontline workers. They're amazing individuals who work really, really hard each and every day. We appreciate the excellent work that they do. We value their work, and we have actually been looking to increase the numbers across all of the healthcare sectors, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I know that we have added more nurses, more healthcare aides. We're also making improvements within our post-secondaries to add more spaces, etc., Mr. Speaker, because we are committed to making sure that they have a really great work environment. And part of having a great work environment is making sure that we are looking at AHS issues.
The order, the Honourable Member.
Given that healthcare workers tell me they feel threatened and fearful of retaliation if they speak out, given the Premier told UCP members last August that fear might just be the thing to motivate healthcare providers and workers, given that the firing of the most recent AHS CEO and board could be seen as an attempt to intimidate others into silence, given that truly setting the record straight requires shining a light on serious allegations of intimidation and government interference, and given that anything less is a betrayal of Albertans' trust, to the Minister, why not welcome it at a judicial inquiry?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the members opposite need to take yes for an answer. We are going to have an independent third-party review that will have a legal background, that will have access to looking into everything that is going on, Mr. Speaker, and we will be able to shine a light on what's been happening, which has been in the dark for way too long within Alberta Health Services, because again, these are Alberta Health Services contracts and procurement processes that are being looked at.
The order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has a question to ask.
My question is to the Minister of Health. Chaos is spreading in so many other areas of this government, while the UCP gets dragged down by this health scandal. For example, 5 programs at Red Deer Polytechnic have been suspended, with a loss of 100 jobs. But instead of fixing problems like this, the health minister is trying to sweep under the rug the worst allegations of corruption in Alberta's history, and taking with it hundreds of millions of dollars. So, to the Minister of Health, why is the minister wasting so much money on bloated contracts that could be spent on so many other priorities, such as education in the city of Red Deer?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the landscape is changing. The international student file, those policies were changed by the federal government, and that has impacted the revenue situation of a number of post-secondary institutions. So that is the underlying reason that RDP is making the decisions that they are. They're making business decisions related to their post-secondary institution.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that the infrastructure minister, or ex-infrastructure minister, said that he has been trying for months to express concerns with procurement practices of the UCP government, and given that he called for a cabinet committee to look into procurement, including in health care, how can this health minister square by standing by this government with hundreds of millions of dollars wasted on corrupt care contracts, money that could be spent on programs to save jobs at Red Deer Polytechnic in her hometown?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate that the post-secondary sector has been impacted by the international student file, and that's directly related to policies undertaken by the federal Liberal government. And it has impacted the revenue situation of the post-secondary. So that's why we have put together an expert panel to work with the post-secondary sector to understand their funding model and to understand what that impact will be. So Red Deer Polytechnic obviously has to make some hard decisions because they relied on that revenue, and this is the reality of the situation right now.
The Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that Red Deer Polytechnic and universities and colleges and polytechnics all across this province have to make hard decisions because this UCP government has been wasting so much money on these contracts. Yes. Will the minister step down today so that someone else in cabinet can clear the air, allow this investigation into corrupt care, and get on with the business of actually helping Albertans during these difficult and trying times?
Yeah. Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, let me say that I'm very proud of our post-secondary sector and the work that they're doing. And of course, I said that the landscape has changed. The international student file has changed. We are looking at tariffs from across the border. So hard decisions are being made by businesses, by the post-secondary institutions. But I will tell you that the expert panel that we have put together is going to do a deep dive into the post-secondary sector and come back with some recommendations. Thank you.
Honourable members, this concludes the time allotted for oral question period. In 30 seconds or less, we'll continue with the remainder of the daily routine. Go ahead.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions, notices of motions.
Honourable member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give notice that at the appropriate time under Standing Order 42, I intend to move the following motion. Be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly, A, recognizes serious questions that have been raised with respect to the Minister of Health and Premier and their alleged political interference and that of senior government staff in the management of the healthcare system in Alberta. B, recognize the serious questions that have been raised with respect to the Minister of Infrastructure and an alleged land transition in which the property was purchased by the government in a manner that may not have been at arm's length or in the best interest of the public. And C, urge the government to take all necessary steps to immediately commence an independent, transparent and judicially led investigation into the public interference and corruption in accordance with the Public Inquiries Act.
Introduction of bills.
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Alberta and Red Tape Reduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce Bill 38, the Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2025. Bill 38 is our 9th Red Tape Reduction bill, and perhaps one of the best. It will be proposing amendments that will strengthen the housing, trades, and charity sectors. With that, Mr. Speaker, I hereby move first reading of Bill 38, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2025.
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Alberta and Red Tape Reduction has moved first reading of Bill 38, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2025. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 38, Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act 2025 is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
The Honourable Member for Cypress, Medicine Hat has a tabling.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to table 3 articles. One is a New York Times article explaining the impact of the Vancouver model of money laundering. The next is a National Post article calling out Canada as a low-risk, high-profit hotspot for fentanyl super labs, where it also continues on to say that 1 kilogram of fentanyl equals 500,000 lethal doses. And the third one is a CTV article referencing the Valley View super lab that was mentioned by myself and the Deputy Premier yesterday.
Are there other tablings? The Honourable Member for Calgary-Beddington, followed by Highlands-Norwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table a letter from Alyssa, an Alberta parent. She asks the government to lift wage caps on education assistance and properly fund our schools. Thanks, Alyssa.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands-Norwood.
Thank you. I'd like to table an article written in the Edmonton Journal by a number of community leaders entitled "Let's Do Better for Our Neighbours Most in Need." And this comes at a time this week when we've learned that there are over 5,000 people who are unhoused in our city, which is a record we should not be proud of.
Are there others? The member for St. Albert.
Mr. Speaker, this article from the St. Albert Gazette, February 20th, written by Tristan Oram. Hundreds of Albertans still waiting for life lease repayments.
Wow. Justice Strathmore has a tabling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to table 5 copies of a screenshot of our own social media confirming that the member for Calgary-Curry was proudly handing out drug pipes.
Are there others? Seeing none, the clerk.
Tablings to the clerk.
Honourable members, that brings us to points of order, of which may in fact take longer than question period. I don't share the humour of the Assembly in this case. The Honourable Government House Leader, I believe, rose at 2 o'clock.
Do I need to extend the daily routine, Mr. Speaker?
Feel free.
Sure, I'll start with that. I wish to advise the Assembly that pursuant to Standing Order 7.8, the daily routine may continue past 3 p.m. And with that, we move on to the first point of order, Mr. Speaker. And it's a good thing that I never skip leg day because I'm going to be up and down quite a bit this afternoon. My first point of order is called under 23 H.I. and J. At the time noted of 1:55 p.m., the member from Edmonton, Glenora, was clearly heard saying, while not her turn to speak, "Why are you covering it up?" to the Premier with regards to the Premier's answer. Of course, the Premier isn't covering anything up, Mr. Speaker. She's here defending our province and working towards getting better health care delivery for Albertans, something that they deserve and pay for. This is clearly, I believe this is a point of order. I suspect you have the blues in your hand, but I do not. Leave with you.
The leader, the Honourable Member for Edmonton, Glenora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My intention, which of course was not what actually happened, was to say you in the plural referring to the government, but I understand what the member is saying. Therefore, for the ability to easily infer that I could have been directing it towards the Premier, which was not my intention, I apologize and withdraw.
I consider this matter dealt with and concluded. Correction, that point of order was from 1:54. That brings us to the point of order number 2 at 2 o'clock, where the Deputy Government House Leader has risen, or the Government House Leader you choose.
Mr. Speaker, I'll rise because I called 2 points of order on the same issue and the same member, one at 2 p.m. and one at 2:03.
These are both called against a member from Edmonton Gold Bar who was heard multiple times, and I suspect that this is the root of many points of order from some of my colleagues as well this afternoon, saying, how much did they pay you? When the Premier was referring to the success of chartered surgical facilities in the province, seeing the increased number of surgeries completed every year is on the up, whereas number of surgeries completed by AHS is on the decline, Mr. Speaker. So to suggest that the Premier herself is getting paid something or is benefiting financially from these contracts is clearly out of line. It is imputing false motives. It is certainly using language that would create disorder in this place and is making allegations against another member. This is out of order. This member continues to do this. This was mentioned yesterday as well, though it was not ruled a point of order then. I would encourage you, Mr. Speaker, to give this serious consideration because this kind of language cannot proceed in this chamber.
The honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to just explain to the government House Leader that I wasn't singling out the Premier when I said how much are they paying you. I meant the entire UCP cabinet, and so for that I'm sorry, and I am sorry that we don't know how much the UCP cabinet has made off of these chartered surgical deals.
I'm sorry, so do you apologize for the remarks that you made then? Is that what?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
I consider this matter dealt with. I consider the matter dealt with and concluded as we've received an apology for the matter before the Assembly. Order, order, order. I have a point of order at 2:05, I believe, is the next point of order. If the Deputy Government House Leader would like to rise and speak to that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, at your convenience, if we can combine 2:05 and 2:07, both of these are called against the member from Edmonton Gold Bar. At 2:05, the Minister of Health was speaking around charter surgical facilities, and the member from Edmonton Gold Bar was clearly and audibly heard saying, "And you get rich," quote unquote. And then at 2:07, the member from Edmonton Gold Bar, while the Government House Leader was speaking in response to the same topic, the member from Edmonton Gold Bar said, quote, "What are you making off in the deal with?" quote unquote, Mr. Speaker. Now, you may or may not have heard these yourself. They may or may not show up on the blues, but I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this will continue to cause disorder in the House from our side of the aisle. We very much hope that the member will continue to apologize. And Mr. Speaker, far be it from me to impose on you your will on the member, but I ask it's a sincere and full apology, or we will continue on this side to raise on these matters.
The honourable member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Deputy House Leader Government House Leader for raising this issue. And of course, I again just want to make clear that I wasn't singling out any particular member, but I was pointing to the UCP cabinet and questioning how much the UCP cabinet was making off of chartered surgical facilities. So I apologize for not making that clear. I will endeavour to be more clear in the future.
I consider this matter dealt with and concluded. Brings us to point of order number 6. The Leader of the Official Opposition rose and raised a point of order at 2:09.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very much along the same vein, while the member from Edmonton Glenora was talking and referenced brain surgeons, the Minister of Community and Social Services heckled very loudly, quote, we know you're not, intending to insult the intelligence of a member. Direct insults are not part of this chamber, as my members have admirably done. I would hope that that member would rise, apologize, and withdraw.
The Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I think we're wading into dangerous territory when we're going to insinuate what one member may or may not mean when they're speaking across the aisle. Unless I'm mistaken, having seen the bios of members on both sides of the chamber, the member from Edmonton Glenora is not, in fact, a brain surgeon. That is not making a comment on her intellectual intelligence. That is not making a comment about her capabilities. Maybe in a different life, the member could have been a brain surgeon, or will may be one after her time in politics. But today, I do not believe this is a point of order, and I think it is not appropriate to make insinuations about what the Honourable Minister of Community and Social Services and Sundry's favourite son really meant.
Are there others? I do have the benefit of the blues, and I am prepared to rule. And in this case, as you know, without an accurate record of what was said and who said that, it's difficult for the member or for the speaker to attribute blame, and unfortunately or fortunately, I don't have an accurate record of what was said, and I didn't hear exactly what the minister said. I think we have a clear example of what happens in the Assembly when members make comments about their colleagues on either side of the Assembly. I would be reluctant to attribute intention, as members have apologized for their intention. Many of these comments feel deliberate to the Speaker, and like we have a free get out of jail card by apologies here inside the Assembly. And I don't want to attribute anything to the minister. If he did say it, it probably is a point of order, but for now, I'll consider the matter dealt with and concluded. Brings us to point of order number 7 and 8. The Honourable Government House Leader rose. This is at 2:09.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. At the point noted of 2:09 as well as at 2:12, I rose on points of order against the same member on the same topic. So I wish to combine those if it pleases the Speaker. At the time noted, I rose on 23 HINJ, where the member from Edmonton-Glenora was heard saying the Premier is peddling disinformation. This is on the record. This is on Hansard. I don't have the blues. That's not something that I'm privy to, but certainly my illegible chicken scratch does tell me that in the time noted. This is not without precedence, Mr. Speaker. If I'm looking at my sheet here in past rulings, you have ruled on this specific issue against this specific member 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, Mr. Speaker. 8 times. Now, I don't know, repetition is the mother of learning. And so maybe this is another lesson learned for the member from Edmonton-Glenora. But to suggest the Premier is deliberately misleading the public with misinformation, or that she is lying or using any form of that, doing indirectly what you cannot do directly, that is, by my understanding, a point of order. It shouldn't be accepted in this chamber, and I'd ask the member to apologize and withdraw.
Madam Member for Edmonton-Glenora.
Happy Pink Shirt Day, Mr. Speaker. I think most kids across Alberta know that today is the day for us to stand up against bullying and intimidation in all forms. I will say that I didn't say the word deliberately. That doesn't mean that what I said was within the rules of the House. Saying Premier spread disinformation is what I said and what I wrote down. And in the moment I wrote it down, I was going based off fact and not on the rules of the House. So for speaking truth to truth and not following the rules, I certainly do apologize and withdraw.
Listen, the honourable members have benefited from the rules of the Assembly on numerous occasions. Listen, the Deputy Government House Leader can disagree, he can sit there, he can shake his hand, he can make head gestures at me. It doesn't change the fact that members of the government have benefited from the rule. Now, will that rule remain in place in perpetuity if members of the Assembly elect to disregard the rules intentionally, which I believe happened here today, and then apologize? Of course, the Assembly sets the rules for itself, and the Speaker is merely the imposer of the rules and traditions and precedent that I know the Deputy Government House Leader is very familiar with. And while he may disagree with the application of those rules in the past, and while he may disagree with the application of those rules today, I certainly can accept that. But it's going to take more than one day for this Speaker to change the traditions of this Assembly without any form of agreement from the House leadership. This is not the role of the Speaker. It is merely to base the rules and decisions on the precedents of the Assembly, which is exactly what has happened here this afternoon. I will accept that apology, consider this matter dealt with and concluded. Orders of the day. Oh, correction. We have an SO 42. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora on the Standing Order 42.
Mr. Speaker, I have the requisite number of copies. I assume you want them distributed before I begin? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll take my 5 minutes as the Standing Orders guide to speak specifically to the urgency as the primary thing, as outlined in 42 sub 1A. And I want to specifically speak to the fact that later this week we will be receiving the provincial budget. And I believe that is incredibly important for us to make sure that we get to the bottom of the corrupt care scandal prior to consideration of what the government intends to implement moving forward, Mr. Speaker. At least shine a light and call a judicial inquiry. And the reason why we keep saying judicial and public inquiry is because it is indeed outlined, as I reference in point C of my motion here today, transparent and judicially led investigation into political interference and corruption in accordance with the Public Inquiries Act. There's very clear guidelines about what a public inquiry is and is not, and the government keeps trying to allude to the fact that there is going to be one when they have not indeed called a public inquiry. They've called on somebody to write a report to give to the Premier to eventually possibly come back to this House. That is not the same thing as an actual public inquiry that is led by a judge. There is a reason why this House has passed legislation in the past to ensure that it does indeed exist, and I believe it's important for us to take those steps and to consider this debate today and act on the urgency, especially as it relates to the fact that the budget is coming tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. So a budget that is based on things that need not necessarily be factual, should be considered with great suspect, Mr. Speaker. And the fact that we have a sitting member of the government caucus who just earlier this week, 2 days ago, was actually a minister at the cabinet table saying that there is deep financial, what was the gentle word I was planning on trying to use? Inconsistency in how public funds are being distributed in a variety of ministries, saying that is far deeper than the one ministry that has been drawn to light, possibly two, until this point, Mr. Speaker. And again, the reason why this is urgent is because this is coming to the House tomorrow. The budget upon which we will pass the benefit of public funds that we all receive, whether it be taxpayer dollars, whether it be through royalties, whether it be through corporate taxation or other means. These public funds and transfers that we get from the federal government, for example, Mr. Speaker, the fact that we will be making decisions in this House in the month following the presentation of the budget tomorrow, I believe it is incredibly urgent that we get to the bottom of this debate, that we actually shine some light and give some authenticity and have us be on a path to having government that we can trust, government that's credible and reputable, government that's not embroiled in corruption and that is why today this is such an urgent matter, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow we will be asked to consider the government's values put to black and white, the government's priorities put to black and white, whether or not they indeed should be trusted to bring forward a budget to this place with everything that's happening already. And I'm giving the House an opportunity today for us to consider these 3 points. So the first one, as I mentioned, was around the alleged political interference as it relates to the Minister of Health, the Premier, and high-level staff within those offices. The second point, which I haven't yet delved into, Mr. Speaker, is around the recognition of the serious questions that's been raised with regard to the Minister of Infrastructure, then Minister of Infrastructure, and a lead land transfer, and the property that was purchased by the government in a matter that may not have been kept at arm's length. This is also very serious and has direct financial implications on the budget, which we will be considering tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, and on every component within the province's financial purview. But of course, the budgets that are tied to the budget presentation tomorrow Albertans ought to have the ability to have full confidence in the authenticity of those documents, the arm's length of them, and the fact that they were done in appropriate matters with due consideration, Mr. Speaker. The rule of law is under threat if we do not act in accordance, and we have an opportunity today to do so with urgency. I would call on all members to see this for what it is, an opportunity for us to shine light on something that that must be brought forward before we lose the opportunity to have greater confidence in the budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, Standing Order 42 allows for a member of Executive Council to respond for up to 5 minutes should they choose to do so. I see no one to do that, and so as such, members will know that Standing Order 42 is a request for unanimous consent to set aside the daily business and proceed immediately to motions other than government motions. So I will ask only one question. Is there anyone opposed to providing unanimous consent? If there is, please indicate now. Unanimous consent has not been granted. Orders, order, order, because we are at orders of the day, orders du jour.
Government motions. Motion number 56, Honourable Mr. Scow.
The Honourable the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to move Government Motion 56, as seen in the order paper. As there's quite a bit here, I will read it all from the order paper. And the motion reads as follows. Be it resolved that the membership of the Assembly's committees be replaced as follows. A, the Standing Committee on the Alberta Heritage Savings and Trust Fund, that Mr. Stephan replace Mr. Dick. B, on the Standing Committee on Legislative Offices, that Mrs. Petrovic replace Mr. Lunty, and that MLA Miyashiro replace Ms. Renault. C, on the Standing Committee of Private Bills, that Ms. Lovely replace Mr. Stephan as Deputy Chair, and that Ms. Lovely replace Mr. Stephan. D, on the Standing Committee of Privileges and Elections, Standing Orders and Printing, that Honourable Ms. Armstrong-Hominiuk replace Mr. Yao as Chair, and that Mr. Long replace Mr. Yao, and that Mr. Long replace Honourable Ms. Armstrong-Hominiuk as Deputy Chair, and that Mr. Bouchard replace Mrs. Johnson. E, on the Standing Committee of Public Accounts, that Mrs. Johnson replace Mr. Sear. F, on the Special Standing Committee on Member Services, that Honourable Mr. Hunter replace Mr. Roswell. G, on the Standing Committee of Alberta's Economic Future, that Mr. Sinclair replace Mr. Sear, and that Ms. Lovely replace Mr. Yao. H, on the Standing Committee of Families and Communities, that Mr. Van Dyken replace Ms. Lovely as Chair, and that Mr. Van Dyken replace Ms. Lovely, and that Mr. Sear replace Mr. Long, and that Mr. McDougall replace Mr. Boychenko. I, on the Standing Committee of Resource Stewardship, that Mr. Yao replace Mr. McDougall, and that Mr. Boychenko replace Mr. Sinclair.
Honourable members, this is a debatable motion. Are there others wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint and Parkland.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have a friendly amendment, if I may, to the motion. Is this the time?
Yes. There's no such thing as a friendly amendment, but
Oh, it's very friendly.
we are happy to move an amendment for you. I assume that you have all of the necessary copies. Go
Yes,
ahead,
sir.
guys. Let's get the necessary copies. And as soon as I get a copy, we'll have you proceed.
I'm very friendly.
Honourable members, this amendment bill will be referred to as Amendment A1. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint Anne Parkland.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm moving the amendment to the motion. Friendly or unfriendly, I'll let the House decide. Clause A, and Clause A by adding that Mr. Wright replace Mr. Bouchard. Immediately after that, Mr. Stephan replace Mr. Dick. B, and Clause C by striking out Ms. Lovely wherever it occurs and substituting Mr. Sear. C, and Clause G by striking out Ms. Lovely and substituting Mr. Van Dyken. D, and Clause H by striking out that Mr. Van Dyken replace Ms. Lovely as the chair, Mr. Van Dyken replace Ms. Lovely, and Mr. Sear replace Mr. Long.
Honourable members, this is a debatable amendment. Is there anyone wishing to join in the debate and provide additional questions or comments? Seeing none, I am prepared to call the question. Honourable members, on Amendment A1, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered. Honourable members, we are on the main motion, Government Motion 56. It is a debatable motion. Is there anyone wishing to speak to the motion? If not, I am prepared to call the question. Honourable members, on the amendment, on the motion as amended, all those in favour of Government Motion 56, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 37, Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act 2025, the Honourable Mr. Williams.
The Honourable the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of Bill 37, the Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act 2025. This bill proposes several amendments to Mental Health Services and Protection Act, which, if passed, will 1. Enhance bed-based addiction treatment services, 2. Provide the authority to grant exemptions in rare and complex situations, and 3. Refine regulatory requirements through administrative updates. The amendments would ensure safe quality standards of care for Albertans and increase regulatory oversight. The overall goal is to improve the mental health and addiction system as we continue to build the Alberta recovery model. It is my hope that members on both sides of the aisle share this goal and that Bill 37 will therefore receive support of all members of the Assembly. Before I get into the details of the bill, I would like to give some background on the Mental Health Services Protection Act itself. It was originally passed in 2018 to regulate bed-based addiction treatment services. Our government has since expanded the Act, regulation and standards to a robust foundational piece of legislation within my ministry and the health space in the province of Alberta. In fact, we built the Act and its framework to be one of the most comprehensive licensing regimes in the entire country. Over the years, the regulation has been amended to enable licensing of drug consumption services, narcotic transition services, and psychedelic drug treatment services. Alberta was the first province in our country to establish regulatory standards for drug consumption services. In British Columbia, we frequently see new drug consumption sites opening up with very little regulation and oversight from government. Just last week, I read an article about activist doctor in British Columbia calling for drug consumption sites to be set up in every provincial hospital. Mr. Speaker, we have similar calls here in the province of Alberta. Thanks to Alberta regulation, there is keen oversight on how and where drug consumption site services are set up. As we saw here in Edmonton, there was a site set to open in Strathcona neighbourhood. Now, before a new site can open in Alberta, there must be community consultation because of regulations under the Mental Health Services Protection Act. In the end, the City of Edmonton would not grant the development permit, but we still saw engagement done to hear the concerns of Alberta. This is a case that is now happening retroactively within provinces like Ontario surrounding these exact questions. Alberta was also the first province to put in place proper safeguards for psychedelic-assisted therapy, protecting Albertans from potential harms with this emerging and new form of therapy. Each type of service, bed-based addiction treatment, drug consumption services, narcotic transition, and psychedelic drug treatment, have their own licensing standards. Overall, there are now about 130 facilities owned and operated by about 65 service providers licensed under this Act. The majority of these are for bed-based addiction treatment services. Through the Alberta Recovery Model, we're working on building a comprehensive system of mental health and addiction care. This has included adding more than 10,000 new publicly funded mental health and addiction treatment spaces, for a total of more than 29,000 publicly funded spaces through the province. We've also focused on continual expansion of treatment services through initiatives like recovery communities across the province. Through all this, we've kept sight of the fact that it's not just enough to add services. We need to make sure that they are providing high-quality, safe, and consistent care to Albertans. We also need to make sure that emerging practices are safe and not putting Albertans at risk of harm as these new practices are developed and researched. We have already seen too much experimentation with programs like unsafe supply and refuse to go down that path. Albertans are seeking mental health and addiction treatment services need to know that when they seek support within the province, they will be taken care of with services that fit their needs and meet the absolute highest standards. Mental Health Service Protection Act provides the authority for establishing licensing programs for service providers and sets out compliance and enforcement tools within that regime. Again, the overall goal is to provide the best possible recovery-oriented care to Albertans, resulting in the best possible outcomes for individuals and families. Currently, there is no distinction between the different types of services provided by bed-based addiction treatment providers. This means that all bed-based addiction treatment providers are subject to the same licensing requirements, regardless of the type of services they provide. Today's proposal will amend and create 3 service types for bed-based addiction treatment services, each subject to their own licensing standards. The services will be 1, withdrawal management services, all at a medical level and scrutiny and responsibility to provide. 2, intensive treatment services. And 3, non-intensive recovery services. These standards and different services will provide clarity on what sort of treatment and recovery supports are available through each service provider when the public is searching. This clarity will improve Alberta's ability to find services and get the right support, and know what to expect when accessing care. The proposed approach is supported by evidence-based best practices aligning with the American Society of Addiction Medicine criteria and the Canadian-based National Core Services Framework. I am also proposing an exemption mechanism to be added to the legislation. This would allow for the mental health and addiction minister to exempt certain individuals and/or services on a unique case-by-case basis from the legislative requirements. This is only for rare and unique circumstances. Reasons for an exemption would include for medical or scientific reasons, or if there's a public benefit. Examples here could be for a service provider in a remote community that can't meet minimum service hour requirements for bed-based standards, or the enforcement of this legislation on First Nations. We are absolutely committed to making sure checks and balances and exemptions are there, and for making sure the highest standards continue. But Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, with the level of scrutiny we have, we need to make sure we're also flexible while providing that high quality and care to make sure all Albertans have access to the care. Bill 37 also proposes several administrative amendments to align the Act with the Alberta Recovery Model, address regulatory inconsistencies, and position the Act as a framework legislation for mental health and addiction care going forward. One notable administrative amendment would be to move bed-based addiction treatment services content from the Act to the regulation or standards. This is consistent with how other services licenses are provided within MISPA and how they are treated. Content that applies to all licensed providers, such as critical incident reporting and compliance measurements, will remain in the Act, of course. Another notable administrative amendment would be changing references from residential addiction treatment services to bed-based addiction treatment services and supervised consumption sites to drug consumption sites. When it comes to renaming certain of these services, particularly drug consumption services, this terminology will align with several other jurisdictions internationally, including the UK, Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands, and removing any politicization from the topic. Now, the difference here in Canada is that proponents of drug consumption sites have worked hard to make it sound appealing to the broader population through euphemistic language. We have seen this with several other initiatives from activists, such as the prescription of high-powered opioids being initially called Safe Supply, then Safer Supply, and now the incredibly bureaucratic and euphemistic prescribed alternatives. At some point, it was accepted to have sites called safe consumption sites prior to supervised consumption sites. Madam Speaker, I'm suggesting that supervised consumption sites, safe consumption sites, etc., need to be removed so that we can have clarity in the description language of what these sites are, which is drug consumption sites. Overall, the amendments presented in this bill better align the Alberta recovery model along with the terminology and the services taking place. If passed, amendments will come into force in the fall of 2025. With that, Madam Speaker, I again move Bill 37 of the Mental Health Services Protection Act 2025 and ask for this Chamber's support.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Curry.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Nice to be back in the chambers, and happy to begin this spring session to talk about Bill 37 right off the hop here, the Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act. Let's start with what the Mental Health Services Protection Act does already. I'll try to, it's a wordy title, and I'll try to get through it every time, but in case I defer to MISPA, that is what I'm referring to, MISPA being the acronym for the Act. This piece of legislation and its associated standards and regulations guide the operation of residential addiction treatment services. In the bill briefing yesterday, the ministry confirmed that there are 130 facilities with 65 registered service providers across the province. Some of these facilities, let me tell you, Madam Speaker, in my capacity as Shadow Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, it has been really important for me to visit as many of these facilities as I can. And sometimes calling them facilities is a bit of a misnomer. Honestly, sometimes they're converted homes. Some of them are quite modest duplexes. Others are brand new state-of-the-art. Of the 11 recovery communities that the UCP have promised to Albertans, unfortunately only 3 of them have actually been built. I've had an opportunity to see a few of them, and they really are quite spectacular. Home theater systems and workout gyms with all the equipment you can possibly imagine. And they have come at a pretty penny, indeed. Certainly over the last couple of days, we have identified all kinds of ways in which mental health and addiction need to be included in some of the conversations around procurement decisions, and to what extent, we need to be sure that we can clear this entire government of any wrongdoing in that area. And I think given the 11 recovery community commitment, given the 3 that are currently operational, given the announcement around compassionate intervention centres that came out on Monday, I think it really does highlight just how incredibly important it is that we have a judicial public inquiry across this government when it comes to the acquisition of a lot of those assets for this ministry that has grown so much over the last 3 or 4 years. But as I said, the great recovery communities, and right down to the small ones that might accommodate a handful, a dozen residents at any given time, are subject to the Mental Health Services Protection Act. MISPA also establishes the framework to build standards for supervised consumption sites, narcotic transition services, and psychedelic drug treatment services. Lastly, they set the community protection and opioid stewardship standards. And I list all of these here because, of course, Bill 37 will not be amending any of these standards. That happens outside the legislature, and that process is not subject to debate by members in this House. The process of setting the standards and regulations that are incredibly important when it comes to actually guiding the requirements and minimum standards around the provision of these services in these facilities are happening in the standards and the regulations, and that is not subject to debate. and frankly can often happen without a great deal of public scrutiny at all. And the devil is in the details, as they say, something that couldn't ring more true given the debate that we've had thus far in these chambers in regards to just how much there is to unearth around mental health and addiction and around health contracts and the services that those ministries provide. And so the Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act is largely technical, Madam Speaker. There is not a great deal actually printed on paper that tells us what the objective of these amendments are. But thankfully, in the brief summary that the minister just provided and in the bill briefing, I think that there are some things that Albertans really need to be aware of and that we have to be incredibly diligent about when it comes to watching for what is in fact going to be contained in those standards. The Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, unfortunately, has been, and the Deputy Minister of the Ministry has been named in recent allegations. Similarly, the Premier's former Chief of Staff has also been named in numerous occasions in the allegations. The level of scrutiny that this government requires is greater now than it was 6 months ago. It is greater now than it was 18 months ago. And unfortunately, Bill 37 only requires even further scrutiny, because what it does is take a great deal of content from within the bill and repeals it, takes it right out, and what we're being told by government in that process is trust us. What the subsequent standards and regulations that are going to be produced as a result of this legislation, we got this. And I don't think that there is a whole lot of confidence in Alberta right now that that process will unfold with transparency and with accountability. To be told, we're going to take this out of the Act, we're just going to scratch the whole thing, and oh, it's okay, we've placed in a requirement for us to post it online when we're done. Not good enough. Not good enough. If this is a government that wants to rebuild trust with Albertans, that is not going to cut it. Now, the bill will come into effect in the fall of 2025, and sometime after that, new requirements regarding residential addiction treatment service providers and services will be posted online, likely, as I said, without great fanfare and certainly without any real public scrutiny or transparent debate. And so, I'd like to ask the minister here what those standards will contain. We've had a little bit of a glimpse. 3 different categories of bed-based treatment: detox, high-risk treatment, and low-risk recovery beds. But I have some other very important details that I'd like to confirm, both for the service operators, the people who work there, the residents who will require those services, and their loved ones. To the minister, will there be a written policy and procedure respecting consent to services and service contracts? Will there be definitions related to critical incidents, and will there be a requirement to report critical incidents for a period of time after a service ceases? Will there be a policy and procedure that require a criminal record check for employees? What will be the policy and procedure for record creation, maintenance, and retention? Because that is the content that was in the Mental Health Services Protection Act before today. And it has now been entirely removed. And we need to have some assurances that those kinds of checks and balances will in fact be contained in the subsequent standards and regulations that will eventually be rolled out and posted somewhere. And so certainly moving standards from the Act to the regulation is a consolidation of power and control by this government. It tracks, Madam Speaker. We've seen it over and over and over again. We have heard most members opposite laud themselves on the innovative, world-class Alberta recovery model, encouraging jurisdictions across Canada and around the world that Alberta is the place to look to for its innovative, groundbreaking approach to mental health and addiction services. And yet, they have made it even harder to actually understand and for some places, maybe even replicate what's happening here. Because for a government that lauds itself so much on this world-class program and service, they sure make a lot of decisions behind closed doors. Not here in the chamber, where the conversation belongs, given the crisis we know this province has been under for such a very, very long time. And so Bill 37, the Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act, further consolidates power and control in the hands of the minister by establishing the framework for the future creation of ministerial standards and ministerial exemptions. Generally, that's pretty concerning, but specifically, there's one point in particular that requires confirmation from the minister in these chambers, and I trust he will provide a response here to the benefit of all of us in the House. Madam Speaker, in Part 3 of the bill, here we go. In Part 3 of the bill, General Provisions, Section 24.1, Subsection 1, this is where we see the amendment of the addition of ministerial exemption. And I think this should be immensely concerning to anybody with a loved one who requires these services, but also what this even means for other healthcare services. I'm going to read it out loud for the benefit of everybody here. The minister may, in relation to an individual who is being provided a service by a service provider or any other person, exempt the service provider or other person from the application of this Act, the regulations or a provision of this Act or the regulations, if the minister determines that the exemption is necessary in consideration of any of the following: A, the medical condition or treatment of the individual; B, scientific or research purposes; and C, the public interest. To the minister, I need your clarification. Albertans deserve a clarification. Does this mean that a service provider, following the standards and regulations that they're subject to per the Act, does this mean that a service provider can waive those minimum standards and requirements for a specific individual receiving those services in that facility? I hope I'm wrong, Madam Speaker. I hope I'm wrong that, I'm not misinterpreting this bill. I hope I'm wrong when I read and seek out the clarification from the minister that what this allows the minister to do is say, resident John Doe at ABC Recovery, again, these are just hypothetical people, hypothetical places, I grant an exemption to the service provider to follow the minimum standards and requirements in the provision of care to that particular individual. What is the point of standards and regulations at all if the minister, with a swipe of his pen, can decide that an individual receiving that care does not require minimum commitments of quality of standard and regulation? I was told in the bill briefing that these amendments were meant to create consistency for Albertans, to create consistency across those 130 facilities operating in this province. But now I'm reading that the minister may grant exemption for the medical condition or treatment of the individual for scientific or research purposes or for the public interest. Those are awfully broad categories, Madam Speaker. How can those exemptions assure Albertans of greater consistency across the system? And the only thing that the minister has to do to grant that exemption, Madam Speaker, is that the order has to be made in writing, and it may be subject to any terms and conditions that the minister considers necessary. This does not put safety, accountability, minimum expectations around what people in those services deserve when it comes to minimum standards of care. The minister just used an example of where an exemption can be applied. If a service provider can't meet minimum standards of hours, well, then they can get an exemption to not meet them. in what world can you just say, sorry, I don't think I can actually meet those licensing requirements and standards, so the minister can just say, it's okay, you don't need them. But that creates greater consistency for the people who are accessing those services. Madam Speaker, I look forward to the response that the minister can provide to all of us in these chambers in regards to that very problematic and troubling component of the exemptions, whether or not a specific individual in a facility cannot expect the minimum standards and requirements that would apply to everybody else in that space. I'd also like to know from the minister that if an exemption does in fact apply to that individual, then what standards and regulations will take that place? Does that individual not get any guarantees around the quality and minimum level of care that they're going to receive? I don't need to remind anyone in these chambers about just how incredibly dire and deadly substance use disorder can be. The vulnerability that takes place once a person is just discharged from treatment, and the incredibly sometimes fatal risks of going into detox without appropriate medical supports. A person can die from alcohol withdrawal without appropriate medical supports, Madam Speaker. And now we're saying in this legislation, in this bill, in these amendments, that it's possible that that person will not be promised a minimum level of care when they go in under such incredibly vulnerable circumstances. So if not these standards and regulations, then which ones, if an individual has been subject to the exemptions? The Alberta recovery model has been celebrated by the UCP, Madam Speaker, since before I stood in these chambers for the first time. And yet, they have now laid the foundation for exemptions to the facilities that are the North Star of the Alberta recovery model. But they have granted themselves a consolidated capacity to maximize differences, not create greater consistency in the requirements of service delivery. If a place can't meet minimum service hours, Madam Speaker, they can be granted an exception. Like I said, I'm not clear on what the point of the whole process is in that case, when they have such incredible flexibility in granting those exemptions to different places. And so I'll be honest, you know, those really are the biggest concerns that I have with Bill 37, the Mental Health Services Protection Act. It's those pieces around the requirements of service providers being removed completely from the legislation, with government just saying, trust us. Yes, of course, these were requirements that were important enough that required legislative debate when the bill first was passed, but at this point, it's okay, we've got it. Not good enough, Madam Speaker. And then certainly the addition that establishes the possibility of exemption and the possibility of ministerial standards is also of great concern. And as I mentioned, I trust that those responses will be coming to these chambers so that we can make sure that we are on the same page about what people can expect when they sign up a loved one or when they have to sign up themselves to access support for their substance use disorder. You know, the changes in the name, the changes in the regulation that applies to those, I think are not particularly noteworthy. But I do note in this legislation that there's actually nothing that talks about employment standards for the people who go to work in these facilities every single day. Multiple times in these chambers, I have raised my deep concern that there is no regulation for counseling therapists. Many months ago, the minister made a commitment that counseling therapists would now be regulated by the College of Alberta Psychologists. I have heard neither hide nor hair about whether that has made any progress at all, though I can certainly assure Albertans that counseling therapists remain completely unregulated, and not even on the radar is conversation about addiction counselors and child and youth care counselors in this province. And so, the people who are going to work every day to provide care for people requiring addiction and mental health supports, many of whom are not regulated, many of whom are not well paid, and increasingly trained certified, and employed by a single service provider here in Alberta. And those are recovery coaches. Minimal training, minimal oversight. These are folks who potentially have, the clients are folks who potentially have decades of trauma, mental illness, increasingly, Madam Speaker, brain injury as a result of multiple overdoses. And we're going to ask somebody with 5 days of training as a recovery coach to provide that kind of day in, day out service for up to a year in a recovery community? There's nothing in here. If we're going to be the world-class service provider that we claim to be, if the UCP can truly speak with confidence about the quality and the caliber of our Alberta recovery model, then why on earth would this legislation not include greater transparency around the regulatory environment for professionals in this space? We have the Centre of Recovery Excellence that itself is doing work around standards and requirements for different aspects of the Alberta recovery model. Nothing in here. Again, that also happens completely out of the oversight of what we talk about and what we debate on behalf of Albertans in here every single day. And so I struggle. I struggle immensely to understand the.
There are others wishing to join the debate. The honourable member for Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I really want to thank the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions for giving this opportunity for us to have a conversation around such an important topic like mental health and addictions. I wanted to take a few minutes before I get into my speech to talk a bit about the journey of one of my friends. Now, earlier this month, my friend actually celebrated 18 months of sobriety because somebody believed that recovery was an option for him. Now, this individual hit a very low place with a very strong intervention that happened. You see, he was struggling with alcoholism so badly that he would go to Costco and he would buy 2 Costco-sized bottles and finish them. And he would do that almost daily. But before he could get to that point of breaking that cycle, there was people that came around him that loved him so much to stop him from being where he was stuck. And earlier this month, like I said earlier, he's celebrating 18 months of sobriety. Recovery is an option for everyone. It's saying that we unconditionally love people, and we love them so much that we will help them out of the trauma they're in. This is a critical topic for so many Albertans, Madam Speaker. Mental health and addiction is something that I have been a very large advocate for, to be able to get new changes in ideas, in thought processes, and ways that we can help individuals. Within my community of Cypress Medicine Hat, we held 4 community mental health summits. And the first one started off very small. We had 7 organizations with 15 individuals in my office, and we were talking about gaps in mental health services within our community. And from that, we actually had 2 programs that came from local organizations helping local folks around mental health and addiction. This government, through Recovery Alberta, has been able to fund those programs to fill gaps. The second one, we had almost 50 people from about 35 organizations, and we had a specific recovery focus. And from that meeting, I was very thankful that the Premier and the Minister attended that summit, that they could hear firsthand the needs, the challenges of our frontline folks helping in this space. We continued on growing these mental health summits to our most recent one that had over 100 people showing up, tearing down the walls, the silos, to be able to see what resources were in the community, share best practices, and help folks. That's the crux of all of this, helping individuals. And I'd like to thank the Minister for Mental Health and Addiction and all of those involved in the ongoing efforts to address this crisis. See, this was even a topic of conversation when we were down in the Oregon State Capitol with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. We met with a number of state representatives and senators down there, and the Alberta recovery model became a topic of conversation that almost took over the few days we were down there. See, Oregon is experiencing an absolute crisis when it comes to addiction, especially in the Portland area. And folks that were representing their constituents were so enthralled with what was going on here in Alberta. They were blown away by our year-over-year opioid deaths. Well, they have year over year over year over year over year increases. Albertans experiencing mental health and addiction challenges deserve the best care possible, and we're going to provide that through this act. And our folks south of the border want to hear it. The amendments to the Mental Health Services Protection Act would provide a flexible response to complex needs. It's going to establish 3 types of bed-based addiction treatment services subject to separate licensing standards. It's going to be authorizing the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction to allow certain persons and services to be exempt from the Act on unique case-by-case basis. And that's important. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution because everybody's recovery journey is different. Making administrative amendments such as languaging updates. And in July 2024, Alberta's government signaled its intent to update the standards for bed-based addiction treatment services in spring 2025 to significantly improve the quality and safety of care for Albertans in detox or treatment services. Our government wants to ensure our response closes the loop for Albertans going through crisis with the Alberta recovery model, focusing on prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery. But this is an ask even found outside of these chambers. In fact, just in the Edmonton Journal, there was a letter written to the Journal by an Edmonton resident. And he points out the positives that this act is going to bring forward. And he even goes on to say, addiction leads to a cascade of issues, including increases in crime behavior and soaring costs to healthcare systems. Helping those who either cannot or will not help themselves in an approach that is clearly worth attempting. And I'll table that tomorrow, Madam Speaker. The Mental Health Service Protection Act was originally passed in 2018. The legislative framework currently consists of the Act, the Mental Health Services Protection Regulation, and 4 sets of standards created under the regulation. 4 services are currently licensed under the Act: narcotics transition services, drug consumption services currently licensed as supervised consumption services, bed-based addiction treatment services currently licensed as residential addiction treatment services, and psychedelic drug treatment services. Addictions continue to negatively impact so many Albertans, both societally and economically. $7 billion related to healthcare costs, productivity, and justice costs within our province alone. It's estimated that 20% of Albertans will have access or have accessed addictions and mental health services in their life. And the Centre for Mental Health and Addictions, based in Toronto, actually shows that 1 in 2 Canadians will experience mental health or addiction-related challenges before the age of 50. This is an important issue that we need to continue to push forward on. Opening up access to recovery-based services to help people live their best lives. When we take a look at some of the stats that are out there, the return on investment, for every dollar spent, there is a potential return of $4 to $7, which can be even increased to $12 when you factor in healthcare costs. Now, I want to share a little bit about a story that my family experienced this summer, just on the healthcare side of things. It was the middle of August, and there was such a run on addiction overdoses in Medicine Hat, where my wife had to take my daughter, because bless her heart, 5-year-olds do some really silly things sometimes, and she ended up shoving a whole bunch of candies up her nose, and my wife took her to the hospital. Their wait in the hospital, because of the number of overdoses and individuals suffering from some of the other symptoms related to homelessness, had the ER full. And my wife and daughter were there for 8.5 hours. Evidence and best practices emphasize the importance of differentiating service types based upon clients' needs and severity. And that could be experienced again in that situation with my wife there at the hospital. Had we had additional avenues to be able to support these folks, then we wouldn't see the run on our hospital rooms, on our ERs. The American Society of Addiction Medicine criteria matches service intensity for bed-based services for clients' needs. It also highlights and is endorsed by the U.S. state, including Connecticut, Virginia, California, Pennsylvania, to provide bed-based treatment for individuals experiencing addictions. Compassionate intervention is, something that we are going to continue to hear both sides of the issues, where there's concerns that it's necessary and that concerns that it could potentially lead to other additional challenges. But again, it's about supporting and finding the best path forward for individuals who may not be able to help themselves. It's supporting those who may cause harm to themselves or to others. This act focuses on higher standards of care for Albertans who are accessing a broader range of addiction treatment supports. Folks need help, and it's our responsibility to ensure that we help them get that help. Our approach must be clear from start to finish, and it's about prevention of addiction and creating a better experience with recovery. It's about closing the loop, setting up the strategy for long-term success, about keeping Albertans alive, and reducing the burden of addiction for them. Mitigation alone isn't enough. We aim for a full and thriving lives for Albertans. Recovery is key. Asking tough questions is important to ensure that we are providing realistic answers and ensuring Albertans feel supported along their way down the path of recovery. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise and speak to Bill 37, the Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act. Madam Speaker, this is a government that loves to make announcements and take credit. But when it comes to the actual work of governing, actually getting things done, following through, Their record is one of abysmal failure. This isn't a government that's worked to build a thoughtful, evidence-based, systemic program to treat substance use, to support people who are struggling with their mental health, and actually address and resolve the issues that drive that. This is a government, frankly, that, in my view, has largely spent the last 6 years lurching from crisis to crisis, driven by ideology, an interest in grandstanding over actual action, an interest, it seems, in increasing private control over what should be public health services, a government that largely turned a blind eye to skyrocketing drug poisoning deaths in the midst of the pandemic in the years following, many of them here on the streets of my constituency. It's a government that's made next to no difference. And that's not just me saying that, that's the folks I talk to working on the front lines in my communities. Next to no difference in 6 years in actually helping those most in need. As I said, I've seen the evidence, I've heard it from the people who are working on those front lines for decades here on the streets of our downtown here at Edmonton, in the communities that surround it. After 6 years under the UCP, people here in my constituency who live here, people who come to work here, people who come to visit here feel less safe. Because this government loves to take credit, they love to make announcements, but they don't actually do the work. And Bill 37 is yet another example. What we've seen is they're more interested in posturing and pushing ideology, seizing control, than actually taking action on concrete measures that would make a difference in our communities today. Instead, what we get is a suite of more promises about things that are going to be built and in place by 2029. Madam Speaker, we've been waiting 6 years for this government to do something that would make a difference today, and they haven't. Just one example. You know, the minister rose and he spoke about the continual expansion of recovery communities across Alberta. What does that look like in reality, Madam Speaker? The government, I've lost track of how many press conferences, press releases, announcements they made about their promise to build 11 recovery communities in the province of Alberta. Over the course of 6 years, Madam Speaker, they've built 3. 3 out of 11. That is not the mark of a government that actually takes this crisis seriously, that is actually invested in stepping up to what it claims it wants to do. The minister said Albertans who are seeking mental health addiction services need to know they can access the services they need when they need them at the highest level. But as I said, what I hear from the people who are working on the front lines, on the ground in this system, some for more than 20 years, is that after more than 6 years of the UCP government being in power, people who voluntarily want to seek help, want to go in for treatment, still face waits of up to 6 months to get in. After 6 years, Madam Speaker. Again, that is not the mark of a government that actually takes this issue, this crisis, seriously. Talking with that same contact, who's been doing this street-level work with people who use substances for over 20 years. They told me about the challenges people living without housing face getting into treatment. The same people that this government is talking about introducing their forced treatment legislation for. They talk about the challenges they face, beyond the challenge of simply coming and asking for help and being told, come back in 6 months, when they have no home, no address, no phone number. They told me about the discrimination those folks can face when they actually arrive at treatment without having the chance to have a shower or get clean clothes. They told me unequivocally, I asked them directly, have you seen any material change in your ability to get these people help when they need it, when they ask for it? after 6 years of this government, and they told me no. The dial hasn't moved an inch. Let me share the story of one of my constituents. X came to my office and he shared that he called an ambulance for his partner Jay on Family Day of last year, Monday, February 19th, because he was extremely sick. His partner Jay suffered from alcoholism. He tried to get off alcohol without medical supervision. He ended up having seizures. He couldn't walk or stand. His hands were shaking. It took 3 days for Jay to be admitted at emergencies because this government also fails to take the crisis in health care seriously. They like to make announcements. They like to take credit. But we have longer wait times in our emergency rooms now than when they came into power. After Jay was admitted, he came back home a week later. No plan was made for him on discharge. The social worker at the hospital wasn't able to suggest anything or make any connections. His partner X didn't get a chance to speak to any doctor at the hospital to ask for advice on how to deal with the situation. Jay had 2 seizures that night. He had to wait a week to get an appointment with his family doctor because, again, this government likes to make announcements and take credit, but they are not making any material difference in actually getting Albertans access to a family doctor after 6 years in power. Instead, they've made it materially worse. 2 months later, 2 months, Jay was able to get into treatment. He was supposed to be there for 3 weeks. His stay was cut short by 4 days, and what Jay told us is it was because it was during the Oilers playoffs, and he was last to leave early to make room for individuals with addictions who were being taken off the streets to be placed temporarily where there was room. So he was asked to leave detox early. We got an update later that year that Jay was not doing well and had in fact relapsed. And the doctor was trying to get him a shorter long-term detox bed, but there were none available. Instead, they were looking at sending him to BC. And let's be clear, Madam Speaker, this is a gentleman dealing with alcoholism. And we have hundreds of thousands of people who are struggling with fentanyl and other opioids, substance use, again, who, when they want to get treatment, cannot get it. And this government is talking about laying down a framework now to force people into treatment when after 6 years, they still cannot supply it to people at the standard that the minister himself just stated is his goal, that when people need it and they ask for it, it's available. That's the reality. And what we have the minister introducing today now is amending standards and regulations for a system that's still woefully under-resourced, nowhere close to meeting the level of need after 6 years of this government being in power. Now, to be fair, the UCP have been spending money on this. We know they've spent millions of dollars on contracts with private treatment facilities and programs on which we have no line of sight. Now, the Minister of Health the Premier stood here today and said they have to get to the bottom of what's going on with AHS after 6 years of them taking control of it. They don't know where the money's going and where the services are. They don't seem to have that concern with all of these private contractors they've signed up to provide treatment services that are not available when people need them. Those contracts are not visible to the public. There is no line of sight. There is no transparency. There is no accountability. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we are calling for that public inquiry, because we need to know how deep the rot goes with this government. And is there the same kinds of shady, bloated contracts being alleged to have taken place under this health minister, alleged under the political interference as high as the chief of staff in the Premier's office? Is that happening in mental health and addictions too? But ultimately, the minister says these are changes he has to make to be able to build the system that will ensure Albertans who are seeking mental health and addiction services can access them when they need them at the highest standards. And one of my questions, Mr. Speaker, then is, why has it taken this government 6 years to get there? Again, Mr. Speaker, this does not indicate a government that has been thoughtfully and carefully building a system to take care of the issue. This shows that this is a government that has been lurching from one issue to the other, one piece here, one piece there, backfilling, and now suddenly coming forward now with these regulations for a piece of legislation that, frankly, Mr. Speaker, is the nuclear option when it comes to helping people who are struggling with substance use. Providing voluntary treatment is the first step. This government cannot credibly do that on demand. And they are working and laying the groundwork today to progress towards forcing people into treatment that they can't access willingly. Now, my colleague from Calgary-Curry raised several valid concerns about the kinds of powers this government is awarding itself and the minister. And again, Mr. Speaker, this is a pattern we have seen with this government, going all the way back to Bill 10 during the pandemic, where they awarded themselves through legislation the ability to create new legislation, new regulation, without setting foot in the legislature. Extraordinary, unprecedented, and something they had to then form an entire committee with their members to rescind and take away because of the blowback they got from their own members, only to come back here and do it again when they introduced their Sovereignty Act. And they had to walk that back and do an amendment to remove that too. So this is a government that continues to think it deserves extraordinary power, but continues to show that they cannot be trusted with it due to their incompetence and due to now, if these allegations are what we are hearing around the corrupt care scandal is, because they are in fact involved in deep political interference. And again, we have a record that this is a premier that does get involved in political interference because she was found guilty of interference in attempting to interfere in a criminal case. And this is a government that wants to give themselves extraordinary new power to provide exemptions and all sorts of other things on facilities where this government intends to send people against their will. All while, Mr. Speaker, this government has repeatedly refused to actually address the lowest hanging fruit. Mr. Speaker, I've put out 2 years running a list of 6, 7 simple things this government could do today that would make a material difference in my community for the folks that are struggling with substance use, because the fact is, you send someone in for treatment, Mr. Speaker, you need to have something for them afterwards. Where are the treatments and supports? For Jay, my constituent I was speaking of, he has not been able to access support, counseling, therapy, things that help him deal with his mental health challenges that drive him to drink. Again, this is a government that loves making the big announcements. They love taking credit for things that actually often don't have anything to do with them, but they don't want to make these simple investments in housing, in actual mental health supports, in wraparound supports, in permanent supportive housing, fixing the issues in the shelter system. This is a government that doesn't even want to report on the numbers because they know they show how bad the job is they're doing. Over 5,000 people now in Edmonton living without housing, many of them struggling with substance use. This government's response is to award themselves more power. So I think we're going to have much more to say about this bill. This is new to us. We're going to have to dig a little deeper, understand it a little better. And I know we're going to have a lot of conversation in the months to come. But what I will say, Mr. Speaker, is this is not a government that has earned the trust of Albertans to be taking these steps. Thank you. Thank you. The member for Red Deer South is risen to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I've heard a lot of negative talk there, a lot of NDP frowny faces. But, Mr. Speaker, recovery is something that is joyous and positive And I appreciate my colleague from Cypress Medicine Hat sharing a funny yet serious story about how the needs of our neighbors who are suffering under addictions, we need to help love and support them to move towards recovery. So Bill 37 amends the Mental Health Services Protection Act, and the overarching purpose of the amendments is to strengthen and expand recovery for those suffering under mental health and addictions through including having different standards for different addiction recovery needs. Now, this is enabling legislation, and the detail will be in the regulations, which can evolve and improve with learnings over time. But as this bill supports and enables greater recovery, I support this bill. And the reason why, Mr. Speaker, is I love recovery. Recovery is a wonderful and a beautiful thing. I'll share with you something that I've been able to experience over the last 2 Christmases. Mr. Speaker, we have two recovery communities in Red Deer, one of which the government constructed just a couple years ago, north of Red Deer. And I love going at Christmas and meeting the individuals who are taking courageous, hard steps in seeking recovery. And I would invite anyone, any member in this House, if they have the opportunity to visit a recovery community and to offer their support and love to these men and women who are undertaking really positive steps that not only will bless themselves, but also their families and our communities. It's such a wonderful thing. And so I had the opportunity to visit these recoveries, and it's an annual tradition that I love doing. They don't ask, I just want to do it. It's something that I love doing. I love celebrating the Christmas spirit and bringing donuts to these great individuals, but also just staying and visiting and learning about their unique recovery journeys. And some of these men and women, they do come from very difficult and challenging backgrounds. You know, some are very hard. But something that I am inspired by, if you've ever had the experience to go to one of these recovery communities, and I again encourage everyone to do that, is there's a great, wonderful culture there. They love and support each other, notwithstanding the very different backgrounds that many of them come from, but they love and support each other in their unique journeys towards recovery. And it is just such a wonderful thing to do. And I will say this, in the recovery communities, there is a very special feeling there. And I've thought about what that feeling is. And you know what that feeling is, Mr. Speaker? It's hope. It's hope. Hope for these men and women who may not have felt much hope in their lives. They feel hope. They see a transformation, something happening inside of them. They feel it and they're excited about it, and there is hope. These are very special places where miracles are occurring. Now, in Red Deer, we also have a Dream Center, and it was modeled and inspired by the Calgary Dream Center. The Dream Center in Red Deer wasn't built by government. It was built by families and individuals with a desire to love and serve those choosing recovery. Now, the Dream Center is a little bit different than the government-constructed recovery community. While the Dream Center accepts all, believers or non-believers, but their underpinning faith and culture is that complete recovery is through Jesus Christ. And again, there's miracles that occur not only at the Dream Center recovery, but also the one that the government has constructed. And one of the best miracles that we see is when individuals have positive change in their life. It is a miracle. Isn't it a wonderful miracle to see that? It's one of the most positive experiences I've seen as an MLA, is seeing these men and women make these courageous and positive changes in their lives and choosing recovery. In both of the recovery communities, there is a change of heart. And it's a wonderful miracle whenever we make meaningful, positive changes in our lives. And it is one of the best things to witness and to experience. And what a wonderful service, what a labor of love undertaken by many of these great men and women who serve and work in these recovery communities. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to contrast the hope with drug consumption sites. And Mr. Speaker, there is no hope with drug sites. Drug sites undermine and work in opposition to recovery. It sets up a house that is divided against itself. Mr. Speaker, if your neighbor was drowning in filthy waters, would you row a boat out and do nothing, watching your neighbor flail beside you in filthy waters, and just before he was about to go under, grab his hair as they were about to be drowned? And then, Mr. Speaker, gasping for air, would you let him go so that he resumes flailing in the filthy waters? What if you kept doing that bizarre thing, Mr. Speaker? What would those on shore think? They would think that is very dumb, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is the smart thing to do? Get them out of filthy waters, Mr. Speaker. That is the smart thing to do. We do not need men and women drowning in the filthy waters of addiction. We need recovery. We do not need drug sites to keep them in filthy waters. Mr. Speaker, you are a parent, and as a parent, if your child was suffering under addiction, would you take them to a drug site? No. You would love and support them to recovery. The drug site has been in Red Deer for years, and its impacts are evident for all to see. Let's speak honestly and plainly. The truth is that drug sites facilitate growing lawlessness, including embedding and emboldening criminal elements, which either abuse the drug site or prey on those living in addictions, some of whom support addiction lifestyles through stealing or robbing businesses and families in communities. In Red Deer, there is an exodus of businesses from our downtown. I have seen it. There is too much stealing, too much vandalizing, too much uncertainty for our local businesses, their employees and customers. Mr. Speaker, I have personally visited nearby businesses in the proximity of the Red Deer NDP drug site. They talk about being trapped in leases in purchased buildings, or in buildings that they purchased in good faith, only to have the NDP force their drug site into Red Deer. Mr. Speaker, some of those businesses have gone out of business. Some have left. Many moved to Red Deer County. And you know what Red Deer County does with their addicted? They send them to the Red Deer drug site. And it's not just Red Deer County. That's the truth, Mr. Speaker. The impact of drug sites on Red Deer has been horrible. It has resulted in a hollowing out. Drug sites cause great collateral damage to businesses and individuals in our community seeking to live their lives, working and raising their families. Mr. Speaker, there should be no drug sites in Alberta. Alberta should seek to support those seeking recovery from addiction through recovery. Alberta should not enable those choosing to live in addiction. That is the right way, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Alberta leads in many good ways. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have no stupid law-breaking drug sites in Alberta? Yes. Mr. Speaker, Red Deer City Council, listening to the vast majority of its citizens and businesses, passed a motion to get rid of the NDP drug site. Good for them, Mr. Speaker. This government has listened to Red Deer City Council and said they will remove the drug site. That is their job, Mr. Speaker, is to listen to Albertans. Yet some are seeking to use the Charter as a sword to protect law-breaking. The Charter was supposed to be a shield against government abusing their power. Ironically, some activist judges have abused their own powers and sought to substitute their own biases and woke views on drug sites, and they are not staying in their lane. Judges are not elected. They are not accountable to Alberta taxpayers. I would invite these judges to consider the rights of those business owners who have businesses seeking to support their families while they sit in comfort and in their legal ivory towers. I would invite them to consider the collateral consequences of their decisions. What about the rights of business owners? The rights of communities? What about the loss of life savings of those business owners in the proximity of these drug sites? If judges persist in poor judgment, they will lose the respect of the public. Our foundational laws will invite contempt. Mr. Speaker, I do not want to see that. I want to see our institutions trusted and respected. Mr. Speaker, if activist judges fail in their stewardships to serve the public interest and fail to stay in their lane, this government should use the notwithstanding clause to resist the abuse of activist judges. Now, Mr. Speaker, sometimes addictions can become so powerful that individuals are robbed of their own agency and they become slaves to addictions and are not free. While government can intervene and force abstinence, recovery cannot be forced. Recovery is a choice. It is not achieved by merely changing of environment. It occurs only from the inside out. Prevention is better than cure. It begins in families. It is home-centered and government-supported. Families are the foundation of our society. We want governments to support parents, to teach emotional resilience for themselves and their children, so that when life brings about adversity, they seek to cope with these challenges in healthy, positive ways. Yet sometimes prevention does not occur, and the only cure is recovery at that point. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll recognize the member from Edmonton Rutherford to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to stand up and speak to Bill 37, Mental Health Services Protection Amendment Act. I find it ironic that the Premier's Chief of Staff, Marshall Smith, who's often called the architect of Alberta's recovery model, is in fact the architect of Alberta's recovery model. A white man who overcame his cocaine addiction is now going to have the answers for all Albertans who battle addictions. This is not a trauma-informed, research, evidence-based decision-making choice. This is about a particular person's journey through recovery. There is so much peer-reviewed evidence about using culturally based, relevant centers when we talk about trauma-informed, evidence-based decision-making, harm reduction, culturally relevant, supportive services. I find it insulting that the member across the hall talks about their visit to the treatment centers, that it is beautiful and joyous and positive to see recovery, that this is a wonderful thing. Recovery is painful. It is excruciating. It breaks families and it devastates communities. How dare you talk about recovery as a place to visit with villains? Mr. Speaker.
Point of order. Please be seated. Thank you. It is important to recognize decorum in the chamber is managed through speaking through the chair as opposed to identifying other individuals within the room. So I would encourage the member to continue to speak, but speak through the chair without identifying others within the room particularly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My apologies for identifying the member. Pardon me?
Don't engage. Don't engage.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. This is exceptionally dangerous. When we talk about when you take things out of legislation, it means it's not going to be law anymore. And this is going to be detrimental to individuals who are in recovery. Having standards and levels that are law are going to ensure that people are protected when they are in recovery. I have heard also that we want to see Albertans live their best lives. And I've also heard in this House that we want, you talked about how visiting hospitals and that there was homelessness that was occupying the space rather than seeing children who might be in crisis. Then let's help Albertans live their best lives and build houses, not recovery centers that are going to hold people against their will. What also is very concerning is that former UCP Minister Peter Guthrie resigned because of his concerns about procurement. Mr. Speaker.
Point of order has been called. Government House Leader to speak to the point
Not
of order.
the member's first day on this job, Mr. Speaker. You can't use a sitting member of this chamber's name in the chamber.
Go ahead.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. A former UCP minister resigned because of his concern about procurement contracts. How is it possible that some of these procurement practices that are being done with Alberta Health Services are now part of mental health and addictions, and we are not calling for a public inquiry? This must be done. We want Alberta to be safe for everyone. We also do not want to see overdoses on the streets. We also want to ensure that kids and businesses are safe and that extracurricular activities are healthy and Albertans are thriving, which is why we want to ensure that recovery has standards and regulations that ensure the safety and the quality of services provided to consumers of these services are regulated, that they are safe, and that they are following the legislation. This legislation proposes to remove that, putting people in jeopardy. Best practices means we should be looking at models around the world. There are other models where we talk about, let's look at the Portuguese model, where we look at housing individuals and having wraparound support services. This is what we need to do. These 3 levels of base treatment, the withdrawal management, medically supervised service, substance withdrawal, intensive treatment, secured residential care for addiction, for high risk, non-intensive recovery, less intensive treatment. None of these have had Indigenous consultation. None of these are Indigenous-led. When we look at the stats and the data of recovery, we know that Indigenous peoples predominantly make up our houseless population. They are also higher rates of incarceration and sadly are overdosing and dying because of the opioid crisis. We are continuously burying people from our communities, from our nations, from our families, without having any impact or voice in this legislation around how recovery will look for our relatives and for our people. What is of serious concern is that the former Chief of Staff to the Premier built this framework and that he himself had not done the work of consultation, that this individual has not done the work of looking at the connection between trauma and recovery. We know that residential addiction services will become bed-based addiction services and supervised consumption sites will become drug consumption sites. Alberta has experienced record-breaking drug-related deaths year after year. This is very concerning to us as well. The Alberta Legislature passed Bill 3, which strengthened the opioid cost recovery lawsuit from manufacturers and distributors consults that allowed the province to join a BC government lawsuit, a move that the Alberta New Democrats supported, because we know what is necessary in the supporting of folks in the recovery journey. Jason Kenney, the former Premier, promised a recovery centre down south. We have still yet to see those beds open for people to go on their recovery journey. Again, are we going to see more empty promises from this government? How can Albertans trust this government to provide appropriate addictions care when they're embroiled in the worst healthcare scandal in our province's history? You know, when I think about recovery, I think about my own family members and how important and integral it's been for our family, for our culture to be a part of their recovery. It is excruciating when we think about the work that is in recovery. The patience, the love, the care that it takes to support someone who is going on Suboxone. The vomiting, the diarrhea, the restlessness, the sleepless nights, the impatience, the frustration is where folks need to be able to go pray with someone who prays in their language, to go smudge with the medicines that they need. They need to be able to be with people who understand and who resonates with their pain and what they are struggling with. We know, based on peer-reviewed evidence, that people use opioids and such because they are sedating and medicating their trauma. So it is their trauma that we must be managing and dealing with. And it's really important that we find the ways in which to house folks but not lock them up, so that we ensure culturally relevant, supportive, harm reduction strategies are implemented by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. We've seen an increase of carfentanil and fentanyl and methamphetamine since 2019 in our communities. It has represented 95% of the related deaths, over 96% of those deaths since 2022. Our people, my relatives, make up 22% of all the opioid deaths in Alberta since January to June of 2020. Amongst First Nations, we have seen a 44% from 2016 to 80% increase of fentanyl poisonings up until 2022, and I'm sure it's even higher now. As a matter of fact, yesterday morning, my cousin himself passed away from this himself. And so I know very intimately and closely what the impacts of opioid addictions has on a family, and I also am very clear what recovery is needed. And we haven't done that. Let's be clear. This province has not invested in recovery centres. This province has invested in calls for service. We have invested in police calls, paramedic calls, hospital amputations. I think we had over 800 amputations. We have over 5,000 people living homeless. And now we're going to create a centre that moves people either into jails or into new treatment centres where you also cannot leave. And so it's a choice for individuals struggling with their trauma, trying to invest in recovery, to choose either jail or medical recovery that is also somewhat of a jail. This is very concerning, Mr. Speaker. Albertans cannot trust this new colossal framework. They cannot trust where this government is going. They cannot trust that they are looking at the best interests of folks who are struggling with addictions, and it is deeply concerning. Will the minister table all the contracts for recovery, the therapeutic living units for the 2 compassionate intervention facilities? I think this is critical when we're talking about the greatest healthcare scandal in Alberta's history, because we want to make sure Albertans can trust the UCP recovery model. So let's be upfront and clear with the procurement process. Who are building the facilities? Who is going to be on each of the nations building these? Will there be any First Nations organizations building these facilities? Will there be any First Nations nurses, doctors, part of this process in the recovery? Will there be any First Nations janitors, cleaners in these facilities that will be housing First Nations peoples, treating First Nations in their addictions recovery? Will there be any First Nations therapists hired to do the work? These are all very important questions for this minister to answer. This is a very delicate issue for all of us to deal with as we see the increase in the rise of addiction and we see the rise of violence. We know that domestic violence has increased over 3 times since COVID. We know that women and children are most vulnerable. Alberta has the highest rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the country, which means we have to ensure that these facilities of recovery are ensuring that Indigenous voices and Indigenous leadership are just as integral. Consultation is the law, and it must be upheld and integrated in this legislation. Hi, Namaskaman. Thank you for your time, Mr. Speaker.
Are there any others wishing to speak at this time? I will recognize Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know what? This is an incredibly important piece of legislation. And I want to take a very brief moment to recognize the Minister for bringing it forward. And I want to acknowledge his tireless work as the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions and his time spent in the community working with stakeholders to make sure he gets this right. Because there are lives at stake. And there's only 2 ways out of the cycle of addiction. It's death and recovery. Yep. And we believe in recovery. Yep. And to hear the member opposite scream across the aisle and say that recovery is tearing apart families and recovery is a terrible thing, the member is wrong. The member is flat out patently wrong. Recovery is the way to healing. Addiction can tear families apart. It can destroy relationships. That is what is hurting the fabric of society. We need strong families, Mr. Speaker. We need strong families to rally behind our people who are stuck in the cycle of addiction. And families have many different compositions. And sometimes that family extends beyond the walls of your own home, and it means your community. And so the members of the community who see one of their own stuck, suffering, ailing from addiction, whatever that may be, it is incumbent upon all of us to step in and be part of the solution. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's a member in this chamber who hasn't been personally affected or one of their loved ones been affected or a relative or someone they know by the throes of addiction. And so we are well positioned as legislators to stand up in this chamber debate this legislation, and make sure we're doing our part. So, Mr. Speaker, I applaud the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction. I applaud members on the government side for recognizing how important this is. And I appreciate some of the comments from the members opposite, but I condemn anyone who has the gall to rise in this chamber and suggest that recovery is not the best path forward. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate.
Having heard the motion from the Government House Leader to move adjournment of the Assembly, all those in favour? Adjourn debate. All those in favour? Aye. Any opposed? That motion is carried. Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe we've had some robust and productive debate today, but at this moment I would like to move that the Assembly be adjourned until 1:30 p.m. tomorrow.
Having heard the motion from the Government House Leader to adjourn the Assembly till 1:30 tomorrow, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That motion is carried. The government the House stands adjourned until 1:30 tomorrow afternoon.